The leader of the three men didn't even look at her when he pressed the barrel of his pistol against the side of the stagecoach driver's head. He just held out his free hand, palm up, fingers curling slowly, like he was asking for change at a general store. "Luggage down," he said. "Every trunk, every bag, every box. You throw it off the roof yourself, old man, or I throw you off instead." The driver's hands shook so badly he could barely reach the straps. When the first trunk hit the dirt, the man with the pistol laughed, a short, flat sound, like something breaking, and told his two partners to start picking through what they wanted. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. There was no one for miles in any direction, and he knew it. That trunk belonged to Clara Whitmore. It held her wedding dress, her mother's necklace, and 24 years of hoping things would eventually get better. She watched from inside the coach while a stranger pulled the latch open, reached in with both hands, and scattered her future across the West Texas dust like it was nothing worth keeping. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people face impossible moments and refuse to stay broken, then this channel is where you belong. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Hit that like button if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories have traveled. Now let's go back to Clara, because what happened next is the part nobody in that stagecoach expected. The road from El Paso to Leno was not a road so much as a suggestion scratched into the earth by wagon wheels and weather. In late September, the sky over West Texas went pale by midday, bleached white by a sun that had no interest in being gentle, and the dust got into everything: your teeth, your collar, the corners of your eyes. Clara had been told this before she left Boston. She had been told the heat, the dryness, the distances between towns that made a person feel like they were crossing the bottom of an empty ocean. She had nodded at all of it, thanked the woman at the agency for her thoroughness, and then gone home and folded her wedding dress into the trunk anyway. She was not a foolish woman. She understood what she was doing. She had written to Edmund Patterson 4 times over 3 months, careful letters that were honest without being desperate, and he had written back in a hand that was neat and deliberate, describing his property outside Leno: 400 acres of grazing land, a house with a proper roof, cattle that numbered in the hundreds. He was 41 years old, a widower, and he wanted a wife who was practical and capable. She was 24, had been teaching herself bookkeeping since her father's shop closed, and had grown tired of watching her options in Boston narrow to nothing year by year. It was a reasonable arrangement. She believed in reasonable arrangements. What she had not arranged for was Dolan. She didn't know his name then. None of the passengers did. I was just the man on the gray horse who appeared from the rock formation on the south side of the road while the stagecoach was still moving, appearing so suddenly that the driver yanked the reins before he'd even processed what he was seeing, and the coach jolted and swayed, and the woman sitting across from Clara grabbed the doorstrap and said something under her breath that wasn't a prayer. There were 3 of them in total. 2 came from the rocks on the right, 1 from behind. The one who spoke first, the one in the lead, rode the gray horse and wore his hat pulled low in the front, which meant his eyes were always in shadow. He was not a large man, which somehow made him worse. Large men were frightening in a straightforward way. This man was compact and unhurried, and the way he moved suggested he had done this enough times that it no longer required his full attention. "Pull it up," he said to the driver. Just 2 words, quiet as an instruction given to a child. And the driver pulled it up. Clara sat still. There were 5 passengers inside. Herself, the woman across from her who turned out to be a seamstress named Ruth, an older man traveling to see his brother, a young couple who had been arguing quietly about money since they boarded in El Paso. Everyone stopped talking. Everyone stopped moving. The air inside the coach went thick in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She heard the man outside say something to the driver about the luggage. She heard the driver begin to argue, and then stop arguing immediately. And then she heard the first trunk hit the ground. It wasn't her trunk, but she knew hers was next. "Everybody out." This came from one of the other 2 men who had dismounted and was standing at the door. He wasn't pointing the gun directly at anyone, but he held it in a way that communicated clearly he didn't mind changing that. "Hands where I can see them. Come on, we don't have all afternoon." They filed out. Clara stepped down last, her boot finding the ground awkwardly because her legs had gone unsteady, which she resented even as it happened. She stood in the dirt road with the other passengers and watched the 3rd man, who had stayed on his horse and positioned himself behind the coach, scanning the horizon in each direction with the calm efficiency of someone watching a door. The one who had spoken to them from the coach door moved along the line of luggage that had been pulled from the roof. He had a knife, not a gun, and he used it to cut straps and pry latches with a practiced speed that made Clara's stomach turn. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was looking for whatever was worth taking. The leader, the man on the gray horse, hadn't dismounted. He walked the horse slowly along the length of the coach, watching the passengers with an expression that Clara could only describe as professional boredom. He wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't anxious about it either. It was a transaction, and they were the ones paying. When the man with the knife reached her trunk, Clara said, "That one's mine." She didn't plan to say it. It came out before she thought about it, which she recognized immediately as a mistake. The man with the knife paused and looked at her. "Good for you," he said. "There's nothing valuable in it." This was also a mistake, and she knew it while she was saying it, but stopping seemed worse than finishing. Mostly clothing, a few personal items, nothing anyone could sell. The leader of the three turned his horse and looked at her properly for the first time. His eyes were pale, gray or light blue, she couldn't tell, and they moved over her with the same calculation he was applying to the luggage. "Then we won't take long," he said. The man with the knife cut the strap. Clara watched him open her trunk. Her wedding dress was on top, folded in the careful way she'd packed it the morning she left. Tissue paper between the layers because the woman at the agency had said wrinkles were hard to get out once set in. The man lifted it by one shoulder, glanced at it without any expression, and dropped it back in. Not worth the trouble of carrying. Below that was the leather pouch where she kept her documents. Edmund's letters, the contract from the agency, her bookkeeping notes, a small amount of money. The man found the money immediately. It was not a large amount. His face made clear he found this disappointing. Then he found the necklace. It was at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a handkerchief because the clasp was delicate, and her mother had told her once that delicate things needed patience to protect. Her mother had worn it every day from her wedding until the week she died, and Clara had worn it every day since then, and she had only taken it off and packed it because she was afraid of losing it on the road. She should have worn it. The man held it up. It wasn't an expensive necklace by any calculation. No jewels, just a thin gold chain with a small oval pendant engraved with a bird in flight. The kind of detail that only meant something to the person who understood why the bird mattered. The man had no way to know what it was worth to her. He simply held it up to the light for a moment, then dropped it in his coat pocket. "Please." Clara took one step forward. Not toward the man, just forward. The leader's horse shifted, a small movement, but she felt it. "That necklace belonged to my mother. There's no value in it. It's just old gold. You could take anything else." "Ma'am." The leader's voice was not unkind. That was somehow the worst part. "Stand back." The man with the knife had already moved on to the next piece of luggage. The leader turned his horse back toward the horizon, checking the road again. The transaction was nearly finished. Clara stood back. Her legs felt wrong again. She pressed her hands flat against her skirt and made herself breathe slowly, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry on the side of a West Texas road in front of strangers and thieves, and she managed it, barely, by thinking about the necklace instead of feeling the loss of it. Her mother's face. The bird. The clasp that needed patience. The three men gathered what they'd taken, remounted quickly, and rode south, back toward the rocks they'd come from. The whole thing had taken perhaps 12 minutes. No one moved for a moment after they were gone. Then Ruth, the seamstress, said, "Is anyone hurt?" And the question seemed to release something in the group, and everyone started talking at once, checking themselves, checking each other. The old man fumbling with his coat pocket to find his watch, which was gone. The young husband cursing with a feeling and specificity that made his wife press her lips together and say his name once in warning. Clara walked to her trunk. She knelt beside it in the dirt, not caring about her skirt, and looked at what was left. The wedding dress. The documents, minus the money. Edmund's letters. Her journal, because she kept it in her coat pocket, and they hadn't asked for that. Her clothing, because clothing was bulk without value. Everything else, the money, the necklace, the few small items she'd carried because they were her mother's, was gone. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pale sky. The driver came down from the box and started collecting luggage, not saying much, his face tight with something between guilt and anger. He helped Clara lift her trunk back onto the roof and lashed it down more carefully than he'd lashed it before, which was too late to matter, but she didn't say so. The passengers climbed back in. The coach moved again. For a long time, no one spoke. The young couple had stopped arguing. Ruth had folded her hands in her lap and was looking out the window at the scrubland moving past. The old man sat very straight and stared at the floor. Clara opened her journal. She didn't write anything. She just held it open on her lap and stared at a blank page and thought about Edmund Patterson's letters, which she still had, and the wedding dress, which was still folded in tissue paper on the roof, and the arrival that was now only 2 hours away, and how she was going to walk into a town she had never seen and introduce herself to a man she had never met and say, "Hello, I am your intended. I have lost everything except the clothes I'm wearing and a notebook, and I hope that's acceptable." She closed the journal. She looked at her hands. She was not the kind of woman who fell apart, and she had no intention of starting. They reached Leno at 3:30 in the afternoon, the coach rolling down a main street that was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without argument and lined with buildings that looked like they had been put up in a hurry and hadn't quite gotten around to settling into permanence. A hardware store. A land office. A hotel with a painted sign that had faded until the letters were more suggestion than fact. A row of houses on the far end where the street tailed off into open range. The stage depot was a small building near the center of town, and when the coach pulled in, there was a small crowd of people who had come to collect packages, meet arrivals, or simply have something to look at on a slow afternoon. Clara stepped down and looked for a man who matched the description Edmund Patterson had given of himself. Tall, brown hair going gray at the temples, a green coat he said he'd be wearing because it was easy to spot. She found him almost immediately. He was standing at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed and his weight on one hip, watching the passengers descend with the patience of a man who had waited for things before and found the habit useful. I was tall, exactly as he'd said, and the green coat was there, a little worn at the cuffs but well kept. He was looking at her before she was done looking at him, which meant he'd been given a description too, or he'd simply eliminated the other women by age and arrived at her. He walked over. He did not smile, but his expression was not unfriendly, more cautious than cold, like a man meeting someone he'd agreed to trust but hadn't yet. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Patterson." She offered her hand and he shook it, a brief, firm grip. "I'm glad to finally put a face to the letters." Likewise, he glanced at the coach, at the luggage being unloaded. "How was the journey?" She had thought about what to say to this. On the ride into town, she had decided she would tell him directly, because she was not the kind of woman who led with evasion, and also because he was going to find out anyway. Her trunk was up there with a cut strap that had been re-knotted by the driver, and if he noticed, which a careful man would, it would be worse to have said nothing. "There was a robbery," she said, "about 15 miles out, 3 men. They took some things. Money, some personal items." She kept her voice level. "The driver reported it. I expect the sheriff will hear about it." Edmund's expression shifted. It was a small shift, a slight tightening around the eyes. And she noticed it but couldn't read it exactly. Concern, she thought, or the calculation of what this meant practically. Maybe both. "Were you harmed?" "No, no one was harmed." She paused. "They took my mother's necklace. It wasn't valuable. It was the only thing she left me." He nodded. The nod was careful, measured. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said. And he sounded sorry in the way a person sounds sorry when something is genuinely unfortunate but not ultimately their problem to solve. It was the right thing to say. It just wasn't quite enough of a thing. He carried her trunk himself from the depot to the boarding house where she was to stay until the wedding. This was the arrangement they'd agreed on, propriety being important in a town where people paid attention to such things. And he set it down in the small room she'd been given and looked around the room briefly and said he'd arrange supper at the hotel dining room for 6 o'clock if she wanted to rest first. "I would appreciate that," she said. He left. She closed the door. She sat down on the edge of the bed, which was narrow and had a quilt that someone had clearly made with care, and she put her hands in her lap and looked at the room. Whitewashed walls. A window with cotton curtains. A small table with a pitcher of water. It was a plain room, but it was quiet, and the window looked west, and the light coming through at this hour was that particular late afternoon gold that made even plain things look bearable. She was here. She had made it. The wedding was in 4 days. She should have felt something like relief. Instead, she felt the absence of the necklace like a cold spot on her collarbone, and she sat with that for a while, and then she unpacked the wedding dress and hung it on the hook behind the door and told herself firmly that she was going to wash her face and rest and eat supper and be sensible about all of this. The man who first told Wyatt Mercer about the robbery was Pete Hadley, who ran the livery stable at the south end of Leno's Main Street and had a talent for knowing things roughly 20 minutes before anyone else did. He told Wyatt while Wyatt was checking the rear shoe on his bay horse, which had been throwing the gate on the left side all morning, and the information was delivered with the particular energy Pete reserved for news that was both unfortunate and interesting. "Stagecoach coming in from El Paso," Pete said, leaning on the stall door. "Got hit 15 miles out, maybe a little more. 3 men came out of the rock formation south of the Ridley Draw, took what they could carry." Wyatt didn't look up from the shoe. "Anybody hurt?" "Not physically. Driver said they were businesslike about it." Pete paused. "One of the passengers was that mail-order woman Patterson's been expecting. She lost some things. Sounded like more than money." Wyatt let the horse's leg down carefully and straightened. He was a big man, not tall, but wide across the shoulders, with hands that were weathered brown and a face that had been in the sun long enough to make him look older than he was. He had a stillness about him that some people found unreadable and some people found reassuring, depending on how well they knew the difference. "Ridley Draw," he said. "That's what the driver told Sheriff Crane." "What did Crane say?" Pete's expression answered the question before he spoke. Sheriff Dale Crane was a capable enough man for ordinary trouble, but ordinary trouble was not what the rock formation south of Ridley Draw represented. 3 armed men who knew the terrain and had vanished back into it were not ordinary trouble. They were the kind of trouble that required tracking, and Crane was not a tracker. Wyatt knew this part of the country in a way that went beyond maps. He had grown up on the eastern edge of it, had ridden every canyon and dry wash between Leno and the border, and had spent 3 years after the war doing work that required him to find things and people that didn't want to be found. He knew the draw at Ridley. He knew the 2 or 3 places where a man could stash horses and wait without being visible from the road. He knew how the afternoon shadow moved across the rock faces, and which direction you'd ride if you wanted to disappear quickly with weight on your horses. He also knew this was none of his business. He knew that very clearly. He told himself so while he put his tools away. He told himself so while he watered the bay horse and walked back up the street to his wagon. He told himself so with some force and conviction, because getting involved in other people's situations had a way of pulling in directions he had no time for, and he had a ranch to run and hands to pay, and fencing that needed to go up before the first cold snap. He had almost convinced himself when he walked past the boarding house and saw her sitting on the porch steps. She wasn't crying. She wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was just sitting there with her back straight and her hands in her lap, looking at nothing in particular, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that he recognized. Not defeat exactly, but the posture of someone who had decided to hold themselves together through will alone and was finding it expensive. He stopped. He shouldn't have stopped. He knew better. "You're the woman from the stagecoach," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and tired, and she had dust still on the hem of her skirt from the road. "I am," she said. "I'm also a person with a name. Clara Whitmore." He almost smiled. Almost. "Wyatt Mercer." He put his hat back on. "I heard about the robbery. I'm sorry." "Thank you." A pause. "Everyone keeps saying that. It's kind of them." Something about the way she said it made it clear that kindness was acceptable but not presently quite what she needed. "They took your mother's necklace," he said. This was perhaps too direct, and he knew it even as he said it. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A very small tightening. "Pete Hadley," she said. "Not a question." "He mentioned it." "Half the town knows then." "This is a small town," Wyatt said. "Knowing things about people is how it fills the time." She looked at him for a moment. He had the sense she was making a calculation. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "are you the kind of man who says sorry and walks on, or are you the kind of man who means something by stopping?" It was a direct question. He appreciated direct questions. They saved considerable time. "I've been trying to decide that myself for the last 20 minutes," he said. "Where were you on the road when they hit you? Which side of Ridley Draw?" She blinked. Whatever she had expected him to ask, it wasn't that. "I don't know the geography. The driver said something about rocks, a formation on the south side." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I know where they went," he said, "and I know how to go after them." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a person is deciding whether something is too good to be believed or simply unexpected. "The sheriff, Crane's good at his job," Wyatt said. "His job is the town. This isn't inside the town." He picked up his hat again and turned it once in his hands, a habit he'd never managed to break. "I'm not promising anything. I'm saying I know the ground and I know the formation south of the draw, and if they're holding up where I think they're holding up, there might be a way to recover what they took." Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. The evening was coming on, the light going from gold to orange, and the main street behind him was busy with end-of-day traffic, horses and wagons, and people heading home. "Why would you do that?" she said. "You don't know me." It was the right question. He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I don't." He put his hat on. "But I know the draw, and I know those formations, and it's been sitting in my mind since Pete told me, and I can either do something about it or go home and listen to it sit there all night." She stood up from the steps. She was taller than he'd thought, and she looked at him straight on in a way that didn't have any performance in it. "If you find it," she said, "there's a leather pouch with documents in it. Edmund Patterson's letters are in there, and my agency papers, and some bookkeeping notes that took me a month to prepare. The money was $12, and the necklace is—" She stopped. "The necklace is a thin gold chain with a small oval pendant. There's a bird on it, flying. The clasp is delicate." "I'll look for it," Wyatt said. He walked back to the livery and saddled the bay horse. He left at the end of twilight, when the light was low enough to keep him from being visible on the open ground, but his eyes had adjusted enough to read the terrain. He knew Ridley Draw well enough to ride it half-blind. The formation south of it had 3 levels: a lower shelf where you could tether horses, a middle shelf that was sheltered on 3 sides by rock faces and invisible from the road, and an upper reach that was too exposed to be useful. Men who knew the country used the middle shelf. Men who didn't know it used the lower. These 3 had used the middle shelf. He could tell by the tracks heading south from the road, which were clear enough to read in what remained of the light, 4 horses moving at a moderate pace, not rushing. They weren't worried about being followed. They'd been right not to be worried. Crane wouldn't have come this way. The bay horse was quiet and steady on the descent, and Wyatt let it pick its footing without interference, keeping his weight balanced and his breathing even and his hands still. He left the horse on the lower shelf, tied to a scrub cedar, and went up the remaining distance on foot. He could smell their fire before he saw it. That was sloppy. There was no reason to have a fire when the night was warm enough, except that men who weren't worried about being followed tended to make themselves comfortable. He moved along the rock face, staying in shadow, until he could see the shelf clearly. 3 men. 2 sleeping, 1 sitting up by the fire with a bottle. The stolen goods were piled near the fire: trunks, bags, a wooden case he didn't recognize. They hadn't sorted through everything yet. That was useful. The man by the fire was the problem. I was not drunk. The bottle was still most full, but he was relaxed, which was almost the same difficulty. Relaxed men reacted slowly, but they also reacted without thinking, which was its own danger. Wyatt looked at the horses. They were tethered together on the far side of the shelf, on a line between 2 rocks. The line was slack enough. If he could reach the line, he could undo the knots or cut them and scatter the horses without going near the man by the fire. No horses meant the 3 men were on foot in the dark at the bottom of a canyon system they might or might not know as well as he did. It bought him time. He worked along the outer edge of the shelf, moving on his hands and knees where the rock dropped off enough to require it, stopping every time the wind shifted in a way that might carry sound. The horses were aware of him before he reached them. He could see the ears moving, one head coming up. But horses in a group tended to take their cues from each other, and the lead horse, a solid dun, decided after a moment of assessment that whatever was approaching wasn't worth alarm. Wyatt reached the tether line and worked the first knot with 3 fingers while watching the man by the fire. The man by the fire was looking at the bottle. The knot came free. He moved to the second. The dun horse shifted its weight, and its hooves clicked on the rock, and the man by the fire looked up. Wyatt went flat against the rock face and did not move. A long moment. The man looked at the horses. One of the sleeping men turned over and muttered something and was quiet again. The man by the fire looked back at the bottle. Wyatt freed the second knot. He moved to the third, which was knotted tighter, and he had to work at it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 40 seconds. And then it gave, and the line fell slack, and he slapped the rump of the dun horse hard with his open hand. The horses moved. Not in a panic. Horses that aren't afraid don't bolt. They just go. But they moved off the shelf and down the lower path, 4 sets of hooves on rock in the dark, and the sound was sudden and clear and wrong. The man by the fire stood up immediately. "Hey!" He turned, looking for the horses, and shouted at the 2 sleeping men, something sharp and profane, and both of them were on their feet in 3 seconds. And for the next 30 seconds, all 3 were focused entirely on the sound of their horses going down the slope and not on the pile of luggage near the fire. Wyatt moved to the pile. He worked fast. He didn't have time to search carefully, so he grabbed the trunks with cut straps first. Those would be the ones they'd gotten into. He found Clara's trunk by the shape of it, a medium wooden box with brass corners. He threw the strap over his shoulder and picked up 2 smaller bags that looked promising and started for the lower path. Behind him, he heard one of the men say, "There's somebody on the shelf." Not shouting, just saying it to the other 2 quietly, which meant they were already past panic and into planning, which was fast thinking for men who'd just been woken up. Wyatt moved faster. He made the lower path at a near run, the trunk banging against his back, went down the slope in the dark by feel and by the sound of his horse blowing air at the bottom. He found the bay, untied it, slung the bags over the saddle horn, and hauled the trunk up in front of him somehow. It was awkward and heavy, and he nearly lost it twice, and put his heels to the horse and went. Above him, he heard voices, shouting now. One of the men was at the edge of the upper path, but they had no horses and the dark was thick, and he was already moving at a pace the terrain didn't fully warrant, the bay horse earning its reputation for steadiness by not stumbling once. By the time he hit the flat ground north of the draw, he was out of reach. He pulled the horse up and sat still for a moment, breathing, listening, nothing following. He checked the trunk was still secure in front of him, which it was, barely, and he looked up at the stars and let himself exhale properly for the first time since he'd gone up the shelf. He opened the top of the trunk, right there in the dark, on instinct, and felt inside with his hand. Fabric, the wedding dress, still folded, paper, the documents, the letters. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, the chain he was looking for. He found it without even meaning to, his fingers closing on the pendant, the small oval shape, and he held it for a moment before tucking it carefully into his breast pocket, separate from everything else, where it wouldn't get lost. He turned the bay horse north toward Leno and rode back at a walk, the recovered trunk balanced across the saddle in front of him like the most awkward cargo he'd ever transported, which it probably was. He was back in town before midnight. The light under the boarding house door was still on. He knocked quietly. He heard movement, then nothing, and then her voice through the door, careful. "Who's there?" "Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I have your trunk." Another silence. Then the sound of the latch. She opened the door and looked at him. She had changed out of her traveling clothes into something simpler, and her hair was down, and her eyes were wide. And she looked at him and then at the trunk he was holding with both arms, and then back at him. "You actually went," she said. "I said I would." People say things. He set the trunk down in the doorway because his arms were not going to hold it much longer without discussion. "Check it," he said. "Make sure the important things are there. There were 2 other bags I grabbed. One's Ruth the seamstress's, I think, from the label. Other one, I'm not sure." Clara knelt beside the trunk and opened it. He watched her sort through it quickly and efficiently, not carefully, just checking. The documents first, then the dress, and then her hand went to the bottom and didn't find what it was looking for, and she sat back on her heels, and he saw the moment she thought it was gone. He reached into his breast pocket and held the necklace out to her. She looked at it in his hand for a moment before she took it. Then she closed her fingers around it and sat back against the door frame and pressed the back of her fist to her mouth. And for a moment he thought she might actually cry, and he looked away at the dark street and gave her a moment to decide whether she was going to. She didn't. When he looked back, she had the chain clasped in both hands and was looking at it. "I should have worn it," she said. I always meant to wear it. It's back now, he said. She looked up at him. There was something in her face that was complicated and real, not the composed expression she'd had on the porch steps earlier. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she probably intended. Get some rest, he said. He picked up his hat. The seamstress is going to want to know about the bag. He walked back down the steps and across the dark street and didn't look back, though he was aware of the light from the doorway long after he'd turned the corner. He couldn't have said why it stuck with him, that particular light, on that particular night. He put it down to the strangeness of the evening and didn't examine it further. He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know it for some time yet. I was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know it for some time yet. And by the time he did, the knowing would have already changed something in him that couldn't be easily changed back. The morning after the recovery, Leno woke up to the news the way small towns always did. Not all at once, but in pieces, one person telling the next. The story gaining small additions with each telling until by the time it reached the far end of the main street, it had acquired details that no one involved could have confirmed. Pete Hadley told the blacksmith. The blacksmith told two men waiting to have their horses shod. Ruth the seamstress, who had retrieved her bag from the boarding house before breakfast with visible emotion and very little composure, told everyone in the dry goods store. By 9 in the morning, people who had never met Wyatt Mercer were describing his actions with the confidence of eyewitnesses. Wyatt himself was at the ranch by first light, sleeping for 3 hours in his clothes on top of his bed, and then up again because the fence on the north pasture wasn't going to wait for him to recover from his own decisions. He had 2 ranch hands, a young man named Cody, who was good with horses and easily distracted, and an older man called Burl, who was not good at being told what to do, but was excellent at doing what needed doing without being told. Burl had the fence posts already pulled from the wagon when Wyatt arrived at the north pasture, and he looked at Wyatt once and didn't say anything about the fact that he was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, which was one of the things Wyatt appreciated about him. They worked the fence line for 4 hours. Wyatt swung the post maul until his shoulders ached, and the rhythm of it cleared his head of everything except the immediate problem of the fence, which was exactly what he needed. Cody talked, because Cody always talked, and Wyatt listened to about 1/3 of it without giving any indication which third, and Burl said perhaps 8 words across the entire morning, all of them useful. It was only when they stopped to water the horses at midday that Cody said carefully, as if testing the ground, "People in town are saying you went after those road agents last night." "People in town say a lot of things," Wyatt said. "They're saying you went alone. To the Ridley Draw formations." "The fence posts need to go deeper on the west end," Wyatt said. "Ground's softer there. They'll lean by spring if we don't." Burl looked at him once. His expression said clearly that this conversation was being tabled but not ended, and that he had opinions which would be delivered at a time of his choosing. He had that kind of face. They finished the fence. On the ride back to the ranch house, Cody, unable to sustain silence for more than 20 minutes under any circumstances, tried again. "The woman," he said. "The one from Boston. You brought back her things?" "I brought back what I could find." "Pete said she was pretty." "Pete's been saying things about people's appearances since before you were born and hasn't been accurate yet," Wyatt said. "Unsaddle the bay and check his left rear shoe. It was throwing the gate yesterday. I want to know if it's the shoe or something else." Cody went to the barn. Burl rode up alongside Wyatt and let a silence go by, and then said, without any preamble, "You know Patterson's going to have feelings about this." Wyatt looked at him. "Man's intended," Burl said. "Another man goes riding through the dark to get her things back. People are going to talk about what that means. Patterson's going to hear what people say about it." "I got back the other passengers' things too," Wyatt said. "I grabbed what I could. It wasn't about her specifically." Burl's expression said, with the economy of a man who didn't waste words, that this was not the point, and Wyatt knew it was not the point. "It's not my business," Wyatt said. "No," Burl agreed. "It wasn't." He rode to the barn and dismounted, and that was the end of the conversation, but it sat with Wyatt through the rest of the afternoon in the way that things said by people who are usually right tend to sit. Edmund Patterson came to see him the next morning. Wyatt was at the well behind the ranch house when he heard a horse on the drive, and he looked up and saw the green coat he'd noticed the man wearing in town. Not a coat for working in, more of a meeting coat, the kind you put on when you wanted to make an impression. Patterson rode well, which Wyatt noticed because he noticed how people rode the way some people noticed how they shook hands. He tied his horse at the post and walked over with a manner that was deliberate without being confrontational, which was a careful performance that required some effort to maintain. "Mercer," he said. "Patterson." Wyatt set down the water bucket. "Something I can do for you?" "I wanted to thank you," Patterson said. "What you did for Miss Whitmore, recovering her belongings. It was a decent thing." He paused. The pause was doing a lot of work. "She's my intended. I should have been the one to see to it." Wyatt looked at him. "I was a composed man, Patterson. The kind of composed that came from practice rather than nature. The kind that had edges if you looked at the right angle in the right light." His eyes were careful. Not cold exactly. Careful. "You didn't know about the formations," Wyatt said. "I did. It made sense for me to go." "Still." Patterson looked past him at the pasture, at the fence line visible in the distance. "I appreciate it. I wanted you to know that." He brought his eyes back. "I also wanted to say, Miss Whitmore is in a delicate situation. She's new here. She doesn't know the town yet, or the people. It would be easy for things to be misread." Wyatt picked up the water bucket. "What things?" "A man going to significant personal risk to recover a woman's belongings," Patterson said. He kept his voice even. "The kind of thing people remember and discuss. I'm not suggesting anything improper happened. I'm saying that appearances in a town this size have a way of shaping how people think." "I see," Wyatt said. "I'd consider it a courtesy," Patterson said, "if you kept a reasonable distance going forward. I'm not asking you not to be civil to her. I'm asking you to understand that she is going to be my wife, and she needs to be seen as such." Wyatt set the bucket down again. He looked at Patterson for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of reply, and Patterson held the look without flinching, which told Wyatt something. "I'll keep that in mind," Wyatt said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't refusal. It was exactly what it sounded like, which was the minimum he was willing to offer a man who had just told him, politely, carefully, with the manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed, how to arrange himself. Patterson seemed to decide it was sufficient. He nodded once, returned to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man comfortable in the saddle, and rode back down the drive without looking back. Wyatt stood at the well for a while after he left. He didn't know Edmund Patterson well. He knew him the way you know people in a town of this size, by sight, by reputation, by the accumulation of small impressions gathered over years of proximity without real conversation. Patterson had come to Leno 5 years ago with money already made, bought land that was already cleared, built a house that was already planned by someone else. He ran his operation efficiently. He was not disliked. He was respected in the particular way that capable, wealthy, private men are respected, which is to say, people stayed out of his way and called that a compliment. But standing at his own well in his own yard, Wyatt turned over what Patterson had said and what he hadn't said, and what he'd come all the way out here to deliver in person rather than let settle on its own. And he found himself with a question he couldn't answer from the outside. What kind of man, he thought, drives out to another man's ranch the morning after his intended things have been recovered from road agents to deliver a warning about appearances? A careful man, maybe. A proud man. A man who understood how a town worked and wanted to shape the narrative before it shaped itself. Or something else. He couldn't tell yet. He went back to work and told himself he was done thinking about it. He was not done thinking about it. Clara, meanwhile, was having a different kind of morning. She had slept better than she expected, which she thought was probably her body overriding her mind on the basis of sheer exhaustion, and she woke to the sound of the main street beginning its day outside the boarding house window. A cart, voices, the distant complaint of a dog. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, and then she got up and dressed and put her mother's necklace on before she did anything else, the clasp catching on the first try, which felt important in a way she didn't examine too closely. Mrs. Alderman, the boarding house keeper, had breakfast ready in the small dining room off the kitchen, eggs and bread and strong coffee, and Clara ate alone because the only other boarder, a land surveyor passing through, had already left at first light. Mrs. Alderman hovered in the doorway with the particular energy of a woman who has information and is waiting for permission to share it. Clara gave her the permission by looking up from her coffee. "Everyone's talking about Mr. Mercer," Mrs. Alderman said, coming in and refilling the cup she hadn't asked for. "What he did last night. They're saying he went alone. 3 armed men, and he went by himself in the dark. She shook her head. People are calling it remarkable. It was, Clara said. It was also very quiet when he came back. He didn't make anything of it. That's Wyatt Mercer, Mrs. Alderman said with the authority of someone who has observed a person over years. He's not built for making much of himself. Never has been. She put the coffee pot down and sat across from Clara with the ease of a woman who ran her house on her own terms. He lost his wife 4 years ago. Fever. They were married 3 years, had a son who died before he was 2. After that, he just worked. The ranch, the land. Didn't socialize much. People like him well enough, but they don't know him well. Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Why are you telling me this? Mrs. Alderman looked at her with direct, comfortable eyes. Because you're going to hear things about him, and I'd rather you hear accurate things first. I'm marrying Edmund Patterson in 4 days, Clara said. I know, Mrs. Alderman said. She stood up and retrieved the coffee pot. More coffee? Clara looked at her. What does that mean? It means, would you like more coffee? Mrs. Alderman said pleasantly, and went back to the kitchen, and that was the end of that conversation. But it sat with Clara, the way things said sideways by people who know more than they're saying have a way of sitting. She had supper with Edmund that evening at the hotel dining room. It was a proper, well-kept establishment. Linen on the tables, candles, a man playing something quiet on a piano in the corner. Edmund was punctual, which she'd come to understand was one of his consistent qualities, and he stood when she came in and held her chair and ordered wine without asking her preference because the selection was limited, and he assumed correctly that she had no strong opinion on West Texas wine. They talked about practical things. The wedding arrangement, the ceremony at the church, modest, which she'd agreed to in the letters, the dinner afterward at the hotel. The house, which he described in terms of what was in it, furniture, a proper kitchen, a room she could use for correspondence and accounts. He asked if she had experience with managing household accounts, and she said yes, she'd been doing it since her father's shop closed, and he nodded as if this confirmed a calculation he'd already made. He was not an unkind man. She kept coming back to that. He was not unkind, and he was not dishonest. Everything he'd described in the letters appeared to be true, checked against what she could observe. He was simply... She searched for the word while watching him cut his steak with the precision of a man who approached most things with precision. He was simply complete. Already finished. Not a man who was still becoming something, but a man who had decided what he was going to be and had become it some years ago and saw no reason to revisit the question. She thought about what Mrs. Alderman had said that morning. Not the words themselves, but the tone. The careful neutrality of someone observing something they find interesting but are not going to say directly. You went to see Wyatt Mercer today, she said. Edmund paused very briefly, a half-second before answering. I did. I wanted to thank him properly. He told you that? He mentioned it. A beat. Is there something about the visit you wanted to discuss? She considered the question honestly. No, she said. I didn't know you knew him. Everyone in this part of the county knows Mercer, Edmund said. He's been here longer than I have. Good tracker, runs a clean operation. He picked up his wine glass. Quiet man, keeps to himself. That's what I hear, Clara said. Edmund looked at her over the rim of his glass. His eyes were attentive. He was a man who noticed things she'd come to see, which was something they had in common. You seem thoughtful tonight, he said. I'm always thoughtful, she said. I'm just usually better at covering it. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to an unguarded expression, and it made him look briefly like a different person, younger, somehow less arranged. She caught herself noticing it and filed it away. Get some rest, he said. We have a great deal to manage in the next few days. He walked her back to the boarding house. He did not take her hand. He said goodnight at the door with a formality that was appropriate but felt, in the dark street, like a deliberate choice rather than a natural instinct. She went inside and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and thought about deliberate choices. She thought about them for a long time. Wyatt ran into her by accident the next morning, which was an accident in the way that accidents happen in small towns, which is to say it was perhaps inevitable but felt unplanned. He'd come in for lumber, which the hardware store had finally gotten in from San Antonio, and he was loading the wagon outside the store when she came out of the dry goods shop across the street with a package under one arm and saw him and stopped. He raised a hand, a small acknowledgement. She crossed the street. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He kept loading the lumber because it needed loading, and stopping felt performative. "You settling in?" "Trying." She watched him for a moment. "I didn't have a chance to thank you properly the other night." "You thanked me," he said. "I meant more thoroughly." She shifted the package under her arm. "You didn't have to do what you did. You know that." "I know it," he said. "So why did you?" He stopped and looked at her. She was looking back with the same directness she'd had on the boarding house steps, the first time he'd spoken to her. The same quality of asking a question and actually wanting the answer rather than performing the asking. He thought about Patterson's visit, about keeping a reasonable distance. He thought about the question she was actually asking. "I couldn't think of a good reason not to," he said. It wasn't the full answer, but it was the honest part of it. She seemed to understand the distinction, because she nodded slowly, not like she was satisfied with it, but like she was going to accept it as sufficient. "Are you always this economical with explanations?" she said. "Generally?" "I'll keep that in mind." She adjusted the package again. "The other bag you recovered, the one that wasn't Ruth's. It was the old man's, Mr. Hennessy. He came to the boarding house yesterday to get it. He cried." She said this without any particular emphasis, just as a fact. "He said his late wife's letters were in it. From when they were courting, 50 years ago. He'd kept every one." Wyatt looked at her. "I thought you should know," she said, "since you were the one who got it back." He hadn't known about the letters. The bag had been one of two he'd grabbed without looking, proximity and luck more than intention. He thought about the old man on the coach, the one who'd sat very straight and stared at the floor after the thieves left. "I'm glad I got it," he said. "So is he." She met his eyes. "So am I. About mine." A pause. "I'm wearing it." She touched the necklace at her collarbone briefly, just her fingertips, and he looked at the small oval pendant and the bird, which was visible now that she wasn't wearing a high collar, and he nodded once. "Good," he said. "It suits you." It was a simple thing to say, and he'd said it without thinking, and after he said it, he could feel it sitting in the air between them slightly heavier than intended. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Goodbye, Mr. Mercer," and crossed back to her side of the street, and he went back to loading the lumber with the particular focus of a man who was not going to examine whatever had just happened. He loaded the lumber. He drove back to the ranch. He did not think about the necklace or the way her fingertips had touched it. The trouble with not thinking about something is that it requires a continuous effort. An effort of any kind takes energy from somewhere, and he found himself short on that particular kind of energy for the rest of the afternoon. It was Burl who noticed first. Burl noticed most things, which was useful in a ranch hand and occasionally inconvenient in a person you lived near. They were mending harness in the barn, sitting on opposite sides of a crate with the leather and tools between them, and Burl worked in silence for a while, which was normal, and then said without looking up, "Something on your mind?" "The north fence," Wyatt said. "That's not what I mean." Wyatt threaded a needle through a strap and didn't answer. Burl kept working. "Patterson's a careful man," he said eventually. "We've talked about this." "We talked about you and Patterson. I'm talking about Patterson and the woman." He turned a buckle over in his hands, examining the wear. "Careful men don't always make careful husbands. Sometimes the care is about something other than the other person." "That's not my business," Wyatt said. "You keep saying that," Burl said. "You keep saying it, and you're right, and it keeps not being enough, and I think you already know why." The barn was quiet for a moment, just the sound of leather working through hands and the horses shifting in their stalls. "What would you have me do?" Wyatt said. It came out more directly than he'd planned. Burl looked up at him. His face was creased and brown and entirely without judgment. "I wouldn't have you do anything," he said. "I'm just pointing out that not my business is a thing a man says when he's trying to convince himself. Men who actually believe it don't feel the need to keep saying it." He went back to the harness. Wyatt finished his half of it without speaking. That evening, Wyatt rode to town for reasons he told himself were practical. He needed to stop at the land office before they closed for the week. And the land office errand took 10 minutes, and then he was on his horse on the main street with no particular reason to stay. He passed the hotel. He passed the boarding house, where the light was on in the window he'd noticed 2 nights ago. He pulled up. He sat on the horse for a moment in the dark street, feeling slightly ridiculous, which was perhaps accurate. I was not going to knock on the boarding house door at 8 o'clock at night. That was not something he was going to do. He was about to go when the door opened and Mrs. Alderman came out onto the porch with a shawl around her shoulders, looked at him on the horse in the street with the equanimity of a woman who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, and said, "She's on the back porch. Went out for some air." He looked at Mrs. Alderman. "I'm not doing anything," Mrs. Alderman said serenely. "I'm just observing that she's on the back porch. Informational." She went back inside. He tied the horse at the post and went around the side of the boarding house because it was the thing in front of him to do, and found her sitting on the back steps in the dark, with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, looking at the sky. There was a half moon and enough stars to see by, and the scrubland behind the boarding house was dark and enormous and entirely indifferent. She heard him on the gravel and turned. "Mrs. Alderman," he said, by way of explanation. "She means well," Clara said, aggressively. He sat down on the bottom step because standing above her in the dark felt wrong, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was a comfortable silence in a way that he found surprising. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Edmund came to see you the morning after." She paused. "What did he say?" He thought about the careful way the question was phrased. She already knew the answer, or part of it, which was why she was asking, to find out what he would say. "He thanked me," Wyatt said. "And?" He looked at the sky. "He asked me to keep a reasonable distance, out of consideration for appearances." She was quiet for a moment. "He told me he went to thank you," she said. "That was all he said." "That's not wrong," Wyatt said. "He did thank me." Another pause. The night was warm, the kind of warm that held the day's heat until well after dark, and the scrubland smelled of dust and something dry and faintly green. "Do you think that's strange?" she said. That's what he led with when he told me about it?" "I think," Wyatt said carefully, "that different people notice different things about a conversation." "That's a very diplomatic answer. I'm working on being more diplomatic." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. He found himself wanting to hear the actual version. "I don't know him," she said. "I know his letters. I know 3 evenings of supper and 2 afternoons of conversation in 3 weeks. I know he's capable and organized and has built something real." She stopped. "I don't know him." "You will," Wyatt said. "It takes time." "I know." She pulled her knees closer. "But the wedding is in 3 days." He didn't say anything to that, because there was nothing to say to it that wasn't either false comfort or the thing he wasn't going to say, and he'd lived long enough to know the difference. "Tell me something about this place," she said abruptly, like she was changing the subject on purpose. "Something I wouldn't learn from being in town." He thought about it. "The draw at Ridley," he said, "has a spring at the bottom. Fresh water, runs year-round. In the spring when it rains enough, there are wildflowers along the whole floor of it. Yellow ones and purple ones, acres of them. It doesn't look anything like a place where 3 men would hide stolen luggage. It looks like something someone painted." He paused. "I've always thought that about the worst-looking places out here. The most dangerous ones are usually also the most beautiful." She was quiet. "That's not really about the town," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's more interesting than the town." They sat on the back steps of the boarding house in the dark for another 20 minutes, talking about not very much. The ranch, her teaching back in Boston, which he hadn't known about, the particular quality of West Texas light that she'd noticed, and he'd stopped noticing so long ago he'd forgotten what it had looked like as something new. It was the kind of conversation that didn't go anywhere specific but moved, the way water moves underground, toward something. When she finally said she should go in, and stood up and brushed off her skirt, and looked down at him still sitting on the bottom step, her face was different than it had been when he arrived. Looser, somehow, less arranged. "Thank you," she said, "for the conversation, not the other thing." "I'm not sure those are different," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in a way he couldn't name, and then she said good night and went inside. He rode home in the dark. He was not, he thought, doing a very good job of keeping a reasonable distance. He was also not, he noticed, feeling particularly bad about that, which was its own kind of information. The thing he'd pushed away kept coming back around, the way things do when you haven't dealt with them properly. That question he couldn't answer from the outside, the one about Edmund Patterson. He'd let it sit in the back of his mind for 3 days, and it hadn't gone anywhere. It had just gotten more specific. Careful men who came to deliver warnings about appearances 2 days before their own wedding. Men who thanked you and told their intended a version of the visit that was technically true, but selectively incomplete. There was a word for that kind of omission. He knew what it was. I was just trying to figure out whether he was seeing clearly or seeing what he'd prefer to see, which was a thing he'd learned to ask himself because the answer mattered. The answer, in this case, was going to require more information. He didn't have more information yet. What he had was a feeling in the back of his chest that had been there since the moment he'd found the necklace in the bottom of the trunk, in the dark on a canyon shelf, his fingers closing around something small that mattered to someone he'd barely spoken to. And the feeling had not diminished with distance or time or work or good intentions. It had gotten, if anything, quietly larger. He put this bay horse in the barn, fed and watered, and went into the house and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not lighting the lamp, and thought about reasonable distances and the gap between what was sensible and what was true. I was going to find out more about Edmund Patterson. He didn't quite say it to himself as a decision. It was more like noticing that he'd already decided and acknowledging it honestly, because that was the only way he knew how to do anything. The decision settled into him quietly, the way decisions do when they've already been made before you've named them. He was going to find out more about Edmund Patterson. He didn't have a plan for it yet, just the intention and the conviction that intention, in his experience, was usually enough to get started. He began the way he began most things that required information. He listened. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of a man conducting an investigation. He just paid attention differently than he had before. When Patterson's name came up in conversation at the feed store or the livery, he let the conversation run instead of letting it go past. He asked Pete Hadley a question or two framed as casual curiosity, which Pete received happily because Pete's entire function in the social ecology of Leno was to be asked questions and answer them with enthusiasm. What he learned in the first 2 days was mostly what he already knew. Patterson had come to Leno 5 years ago. He'd bought the Garver property south of town, 800 acres already fenced, house already standing, which had struck some people at the time as odd because Garver hadn't been planning to sell. The price had been fair. Nobody said it wasn't fair. But Garver had been gone within 3 months, moved to his daughter's place in New Mexico, and hadn't been back. Patterson ran cattle efficiently. He paid his debts. He was a member of the town council and attended its meetings reliably and voted sensibly and kept his opinions measured. He had been married before. This Wyatt had heard vaguely but hadn't attended to. A woman named Mira, from somewhere east of here. Kansas, some said. Missouri, others said. She had died 2 years after they married. Illness. Patterson had been in Leno about a year at that point, so the marriage had been before he arrived. Nobody in town had met her. That was the shape of it, and on its own it was nothing. Men came west with histories that got left behind. That was half the reason people came west. It was the land office clerk, a dry, meticulous man named Fitch, who had worked there for 11 years and retained every transaction with the fidelity of a ledger, who said the thing that caught. Wyatt had gone in to file paperwork on a water right for the North Pasture, a legitimate errand, something he'd been putting off for weeks. And while Fitch was locating the relevant forms, Wyatt said, as easily as he could manage, "Patterson ever have water right trouble on his place? I heard something about it." He hadn't heard anything about it. He was testing. Fitch paused almost imperceptibly. "Nothing on record here," he said. He located the forms and laid them on the counter. "You'd want to check the county seat for anything before my tenure," which was not an answer to the question Wyatt had actually asked, which was whether there'd been trouble. It was an answer to a different, more careful question. Wyatt filled out his forms. He was thinking. "The Garver property sale," he said while he was writing. "That would be in the records here?" "Filed correctly," Fitch said, with the particular precision of a man for whom correct filing was a point of personal pride. He paused again, a fraction longer than the pause deserved. "Everything filed correctly." Wyatt looked at him. Fitch was looking at the forms with great attention. "Fitch," Wyatt said, "if you have something to say, now would be a reasonable time." Fitch looked up. I was a man who weighed things carefully, who understood that information was a different category of thing than gossip, and who had apparently been carrying something for long enough that the weight of it was visible when someone asked directly. "I don't have anything to say," Fitch said. "I have a question I've had for 5 years that nobody's ever asked the right way. You're not quite asking it the right way either." He tapped the forms. "Fill these out completely. Second copy goes to the county." Wyatt finished the forms. He slid them across the counter. Fitch examined them. Then, without looking up, he said very quietly, as if he were commenting on the weather, "You might consider what it means when a man buys a property in cash, full price, 30 days after the owner's wife passes away. Not the owner, the owner's wife." He stamped the forms. "That'll be 20 cents for the filing fee," he said, and the conversation was finished. Wyatt walked out into the midday street and stood in the sun and turned that over. Garver's wife had died. Then Patterson had appeared and bought the property. He'd been in the county before, long enough to know about the sale, long enough to make his approach with the right timing, long enough to know that Garver, grieving and alone on 800 acres, might want to be somewhere else. That could be opportunism. Men made offers on properties when they saw openings. That was commerce. But Fitch, who had filed every piece of land paperwork in this county for 11 years and remembered all of it, had been carrying a question about it for 5 years without saying it to anyone. That was not the behavior of a man who thought he was looking at ordinary commerce. Wyatt was still standing in the street when Ruth the seamstress came out of her shop and nearly walked into him, stepped back with a small sound of surprise, and then looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent the last 3 days thinking about something and had been waiting for an opportunity to say it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Ruth. I was going to come find you." She held the door of her shop open. "Come in, please. I don't want to do this in the street." He went in. The shop was small and warm and smelled of fabric and the particular chemical sharpness of dye. Ruth closed the door and turned to face him with her hands clasped in front of her, and he could see she was choosing her words with care. "You asked about Patterson," she said, "to Pete Hadley. Pete told me because Pete tells everyone everything." "I know," Wyatt said. "I was on that stagecoach," Ruth said, "from El Paso. Before the robbery, we had a long ride together, Miss Whitmore and I. We talked." She paused. "She's a good woman, practical and honest, the kind that doesn't lean on anyone unless there's no other choice. She talked about Patterson the way a sensible person talks about a sensible decision. She wasn't romantic about it. She was clear-eyed. She said she needed a stable situation, and he seemed to offer one, and she was willing to work hard to make it a real partnership." "That sounds like her," Wyatt said. "I'm telling you this so you understand what's at stake for her." Ruth looked at him directly. "She's not a woman who's going to be saved. She's a woman who needs accurate information. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Wyatt said. "Good." Ruth unclasped her hands and moved to her work table, doing something with fabric that she didn't seem to need to do, a displacement activity. "My cousin lives in Hays County, Kansas. She wrote me 6 months ago, something she'd heard. She wrote it as gossip, because that's how things travel. But after I met Mr. Patterson here, I kept thinking about it." Wyatt waited. A man matching his description, same age, same manner, the green coat, was known in Hays County 2 years before he came here. He was married there too. A woman named Louise Crane. Not the sheriff's family, just the same name. She died. Ruth folded the fabric once, precisely. It was called a fever. She was 26. They'd been married 14 months. He left Hays County within 6 weeks of her death, took everything that was hers by the marriage. The shop was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street sounds continued, cartwheels, someone calling to someone else, the ordinary texture of a Tuesday in a small town. "You're sure it was him?" Wyatt said. It wasn't a question, quite. "My cousin described him, the coat, the way he talks. Measured," she said, "like a man who thinks before every sentence. The eyes." She put the fabric down. "I'm not sure the way a judge is sure. I'm sure the way a woman is sure when something sits in her chest and won't move." "Does anyone else know this?" "I haven't told anyone." I've been trying to decide what to say and to whom, and whether I had any right to say it at all when I can't prove it." She looked at him steadily. "Then I heard you'd been asking about him. And I thought, if there's a person in this town who would do something careful and right with information like this, without making it into a spectacle or a disaster." She stopped. "I thought it might be you." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Fitch and the land sale and the 30 days. He thought about a woman in Kansas named Louise Crane, 26 years old, married 14 months, dead of a fever, and a man who left quickly afterward with everything that was hers. He thought about Mira, from somewhere east of here, who nobody in Leno had ever met. He thought about Clara Whitmore, who was getting married in 2 days. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." "I need you to understand something," Ruth said. "I could be wrong. The coat and the manner and the eyes could belong to 2 different men. It happens." She met his gaze. "But if I'm right, she is walking into something I wouldn't wish on anyone, and I couldn't say nothing and then watch it happen." "You did the right thing," he said. He left the shop and stood on the street again, and this time he didn't stand still. He started walking, because standing still was no longer an option, and he needed to think while moving. 2 women. Possibly 3. Garver's wife, though that was less clear, more circumstantial, more the behavior of a man watching for opportunity than anything direct. But Louise Crane in Hayes County. And Mira, wherever she'd come from, whatever had happened to her. 2 wives dead in the early years of marriage. 1 man who moved on quickly both times with what the marriage had given him. A man who was now engaged to a 3rd woman who had arrived in town with documents, a small amount of money, a necklace, and no family within 2,000 miles to raise questions if something went wrong. Wyatt stopped at the corner of the main street and the side road that led toward the Patterson property and looked in that direction without seeing it. His chest felt tight and particular, the way it felt when something became certain before you had all the evidence for certainty. He'd felt it before, doing other kinds of work in other kinds of places, and he'd learned to pay attention to it without letting it run ahead of the facts. The facts were 2 dead wives, a pattern of convenient property acquisition, a man who gave carefully incomplete information to the people closest to him, and a wedding in 48 hours. He needed more than what he had. He needed something he could put in front of Clara that was more than his instinct and Ruth's cousin's letter. Because Clara Whitmore was not a woman who would act on instinct and a letter. She had told him as much, not in those words, but in the way she moved through the world, careful and honest and requiring reasons rather than impressions. He had to go to the county seat. Farlow was 18 miles east, a day's ride there and back, if he pushed. He could be back by nightfall tomorrow, which was the day before the wedding. He went to find Sheriff Crane. Crane was in his office, a small room behind the jail building, doing paperwork with the concentration of a man who found paperwork difficult but necessary. He was in his 50s, solid and deliberate, with a face that had processed a great deal of trouble over the years, and had arrived at a baseline expression of patient readiness. He looked up when Wyatt came in without knocking. "Mercer," he said. "I need to talk to you about Patterson," Wyatt said. He sat without being invited, because Crane was a man who respected directness, and they'd known each other long enough for directness to be the appropriate register. "What do you know about his previous marriages?" Crane put his pen down. He looked at Wyatt in a way that told Wyatt immediately that this was not a surprise. "What do you know?" Crane said. "A woman in Hayes County named Louise Crane," Wyatt said. 2 years before he came here, married 14 months, died of fever. He left within 6 weeks. He paused. Took everything the marriage had given him. Crane was quiet for a moment. "How'd you get that?" "Ruth, seamstress. Her cousin's in Hayes County." Crane picked up his pen and then put it down again, which was the action of a man who had been waiting for a conversation and wasn't sure he was glad it had arrived. "I heard something similar about 18 months ago," he said, "from a deputy I know in the county east of here. Nothing formal, just a man asking questions the way deputies ask questions, quietly, without anything to attach it to yet." "You didn't look into it." "I looked into what I could look into from here," Crane said, with a sharpness that was fair given the implicit accusation. "I have no jurisdiction in Hayes County. I have no jurisdiction anywhere Patterson hasn't committed a crime in my territory. 2 dead wives in other places, each certified as illness by doctors of record, is not something I can act on from Leno." He looked at Wyatt. "What would you have me do?" Arrest a man for marrying twice and being unlucky twice? I'd have you go to Farlow with me tomorrow, Wyatt said. County records. If there's a pattern in how those properties transferred after the marriages, it'll be in the filings. Something Fitch was trying to tell me without saying it. Crane looked at him for a long time. The office was quiet. Through the wall, one of the cells was occupied by a man sleeping off a drinking problem, his snoring occasional and rhythmic. The wedding's day after tomorrow, Crane said. I know. If we go to Farlow and find nothing definitive, and you raise this with the woman and she calls the wedding off based on our suspicion, and it turns out Patterson's just an unlucky man who buries his wives. Crane stopped. You understand what that does to her, in this town, in her situation. I understand, Wyatt said. I also understand what happens if we find something and don't tell her. Crane looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then back at Wyatt, and then at his paperwork, which he was clearly not going to be finishing tonight. 6 a.m, he said. Bring a fast horse. Wyatt brought the bay, which was the fastest thing he owned and had earned the description 3 nights ago in the canyon. They rode out at first light, hitting the road to Farlow as the sky went from black to dark blue, to the particular washed gray that preceded sunrise in this country. Crane rode a sorrel mare that matched the bay's pace without argument, and they didn't talk much on the way out because there was nothing productive to say yet, and both of them knew it. Farlow was a larger town than Leno, a proper county seat with a courthouse and a records office that occupied the whole of the courthouse's ground floor and smelled of old paper and ink. The clerk there was a young woman with spectacles and a phenomenal memory for her filing system, and she had what they needed inside of 40 minutes. The picture that came together from the filings was not proof of what Wyatt feared in the way a confession was proof, but it was proof of something. Edmund Patterson, under that name and one variation of it, had been recorded in the county adjacent to Hayes County, which shared some filing with Farlow through a regional agreement, in connection with a property transfer following the death of a Louise Breen née Crane. The property had transferred to him as surviving spouse within 3 weeks of her death. He had sold it 2 months later at a profit. Before that, a woman named Mira Holloway, married in Missouri, dead of fever in her 2nd year of marriage. Property transferred, sold. The pattern was the same each time. Marry, wait, inherit, move on. There was nothing in the filings that constituted a crime on its face. Women died of fevers. Husbands inherited property. The law was constructed around exactly this kind of transfer, but the fever in each case had arrived within 2 years of the marriage, and in each case the illness had been brief, days, not weeks, and in each case the husband had been the only person with the woman at the time. And Edmund Patterson's current intended had arrived in Leno with a necklace that was old gold, a small amount of money, and documentation of her bookkeeping skills. She had no family here, no one who would ask questions on her behalf if something went wrong. She was, from a certain ruthless angle, an ideal candidate. Crane stood at the records counter and looked at the copies the clerk had made for them and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "It's not enough for an arrest." "No," Wyatt said. "It's enough for a conversation," Crane said. He folded the papers carefully. "A very serious one." They rode back faster than they'd ridden out. Wyatt pushed the bay harder than he usually would, and the horse responded with what felt like understanding, which was anthropomorphizing but useful to believe. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon when they hit Leno's main street and Wyatt went straight for the boarding house. Clara was there. Mrs. Alderman opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd seen him coming up the street, which meant she'd been watching, which meant she had opinions about this situation that she was expressing through preparation rather than words. "She's in the parlor," Mrs. Alderman said. "I'll get coffee." "This isn't a coffee situation," Wyatt said. "Every situation is a coffee situation," Mrs. Alderman said firmly, and went to the kitchen. Clara was sitting in the boarding house parlor with her journal open in her lap and a pen in her hand, but she hadn't been writing. She looked up when he came in, and his face must have said something before he could arrange it, because she closed the journal immediately and sat up straight with the particular posture of a person preparing to receive information they've been half expecting. "Sit down," she said. Not a question. Instruction. He sat. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her about Fitch and the timing of the Garver land purchase, and what Ruth had said, and what they'd found in Farlow. He told it plainly, without drama and without softening, because she had told him on the back steps of this house that she needed accurate information, and this was accurate information, and she deserved it delivered like it was. She listened without interrupting. Her face went through several things while he talked. Not obvious things, not theatrical things, the small internal movements of a person processing something that is both surprising and, in some way, not entirely surprising. He noticed she put her hand flat on the journal cover at one point and pressed it there, steadying. When he finished, she was quiet for what felt like a long time. 2 women, she said, that we found records for. And the Garver property. Circumstantial. A man watching for opportunities. She looked at the window. The light outside was going, the last of it orange and low. You said the illness was brief, both times, days. That's what the filings indicate. The death certificates. Doctors sign what they're told sometimes, she said, especially in small places where the husband is a respected man and there's no one asking different questions. Yes, he said. She put the journal on the side table and stood up. She was doing the thing he'd noticed before, holding herself together through will. But this time it looked different. This time it looked less like endurance and more like something being built in real time, something that was going to last. I believed he was a practical man making a practical arrangement, she said. She wasn't talking to Wyatt specifically. She was thinking out loud, organizing. I told myself that practical was enough, that I was being sensible instead of sentimental. A short pause. I told myself that what I noticed, the way he answered questions, the way he managed what he shared, was just the character of a private man. It might still be, Wyatt said, because it was the honest thing to say. What we have is a pattern, not a certainty. She looked at him. You believe it, she said. I can tell you believe it. He didn't say anything. So do I, she said quietly. I think I have since the back porch. Maybe before. She crossed her arms, not hugging herself, more like containing something. That's the part I'm most angry about, that I noticed and I talked myself out of it because I needed this to work. That's not weakness, Wyatt said. I know what it is. Her voice had an edge that wasn't directed at him. It's wanting something badly enough that you make allowances. She moved to the window and looked out at the street. The wedding is tomorrow morning. I know. If I call it off without a clear accusation, without something I can say publicly, she stopped. He'll deny it. He'll say I've been influenced by you, by someone who had a reason to interfere, and the town will have to choose between his version and mine, and he's been here 5 years and I've been here 5 days. Wyatt sat with that, because it was accurate and she needed to work through it without him trying to solve it for her. Crane has the papers from Farlow, he said. He's going to talk to Patterson tonight. Not arrest him. He can't. But confront him with what we know and watch how he responds. Sometimes a man's response to being confronted tells you more than the evidence. She turned from the window. Will Patterson run? If he's what we think he is, and he knows we know, he'll calculate his options fast, Wyatt said. Running is one of them. Staying and managing it is another. He's a careful man. He'll weigh them. I have to talk to him, Clara said. Clara, I have to look at him when he knows I know, she said. I have to see it for myself. Not because I don't believe you. I do. Because I need to be the one who sees it. This is my decision, my life. I won't make it on someone else's certainty. He looked at her. He wanted to say it wasn't safe, but this woman had ridden alone across 2,000 miles of country to marry a stranger, and she had sat still with a gun pointed at her stagecoach and not cried once, and telling her something wasn't safe was not going to change what she'd decided. I'll come with you, he said. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not, he said. I'm telling you I will. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, but an acknowledgement of something. We go to Crane first, she said, together, and we hear what Patterson says to Crane, and then I decide what I do. Agreed, Wyatt said. Mrs. Alderman appeared in the doorway with coffee she had apparently made and intended to deliver regardless of the conversation about whether this was a coffee situation. She looked at the two of them standing on opposite sides of the parlor, facing each other, and she set the tray down on the table and said, Drink this, both of you. Whatever you're about to do it with coffee in you. Neither of them argued. They drank the coffee in silence, and the night came down fully outside the parlor window, and Clara Whitmore looked at the cup in her hands and looked at the man sitting across the room from her and said, very quietly, almost to herself, "I didn't come all this way to be someone's arrangement." Wyatt looked at her. "No," he said, "you didn't." The clock on Mrs. Alderman's mantel read 8:47 when they set the cups down and went to find Crane. The town outside was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place settling into evening, unaware that somewhere in a parlor on the main street, the shape of tomorrow had just changed entirely. Patterson didn't know it yet. By the time he did, it would be too late to manage it the way he'd managed everything else. Quietly, carefully, with no one asking the right questions until now. He had built his whole system on people not asking the right questions. What he hadn't planned for was a woman who required accurate information, and a man who couldn't let the thing sit, and a land office clerk who had been carrying a question for 5 years and finally told it to the right person. Small towns, Wyatt thought, as they walked toward the sheriff's office in the dark. They were the worst possible place to build a system on other people's silence. Because in a small town, sooner or later, everybody talked. Crane's office was lit when they reached it, which meant he was still there, which meant he hadn't gone to Patterson yet. Wyatt pushed the door open without knocking, and Crane looked up from the papers on his desk, the Farlow copies spread out and studied, and took in both of them standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who had been expecting this, but not quite yet. "I was about to come find you," Crane said. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore." "Sheriff." She came in and closed the door behind her. "I know what you found in Farlow. Wyatt told me." She looked at the papers on his desk. "I want to be there when you talk to Patterson." Crane leaned back in his chair and looked at Wyatt, who gave him nothing, because this was Clara's request to make and his to assess. "That's not standard," Crane said. "Nothing about this is standard," Clara said. "He's going to say it's slander. He's going to say Wyatt interfered out of jealousy and that you're acting on gossip from a woman in Kansas whose cousin heard something at a social and passed it along. He's going to be very calm about it and very reasonable, and he's going to look at me and say, if I'm there, he's going to say he can explain everything, and I need to see his face when he says it." Crane looked at her for a long moment. "You understand this might not go the way you want it to go," he said. "He might explain it, some of it, and you'll be standing there having accused a man the day before your wedding." "I understand that," she said. "You understand this could follow you in this town for a long time." "Sheriff Crane," she said, "I came 2,000 miles to marry a man I'd never met because I had run out of other reasonable options. I have no family here, no property, no established position. I am already in the most precarious situation I've been in since my father's business failed. What exactly do you think I have left to lose that would make me back down from this?" Crane looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the Farlow papers, folded them, and put them in his coat pocket. "We go together," he said. "I do the talking first. You follow my lead until I say otherwise." He stood up and got his hat. "And Mercer, you're there as a witness, nothing else. You understand me?" "Understood," Wyatt said. They walked to Patterson's house. It was a 20-minute walk through town and then another 10 along the road south, the house visible from the road. Once they cleared the last buildings of Leno's Edge, a solid 2-story structure with good bones and a porch that had been built for sitting on and rarely used for it, to judge by the condition. The lamps were lit on the ground floor. Patterson was home. He answered the door himself, which meant he didn't have staff in the house in the evenings, which was one more detail that would have read as modest and self-sufficient under different circumstances. He looked at the 3 of them on his porch, Crane, Clara, Wyatt, and his face went through something fast and controlled. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who has run his calculations and arrived at a number he was afraid of, now seeing that number confirmed. He composed himself in about 2 seconds. Wyatt watched it happen and felt a cold precision in his chest that was the opposite of anger. "Dale," Patterson said to Crane, "Miss Whitmore." His eyes moved to Wyatt and stayed there for a half-beat longer. "Come in." He took them to the front room, a clean, well-furnished space that felt more like a display of a life than a life being lived in. He offered chairs. Crane sat. Clara sat. Wyatt stood near the door, which was where he'd decided to be. Patterson remained standing also, which was a choice. on his feet, on his own ground, positioned as host rather than subject. "I assume this isn't a social call," he said. "No," Crane said. He didn't move toward the papers yet. "I want to ask you some questions about your history before Leno, specifically about your previous marriages." Patterson's posture didn't change. "I've been married twice," he said. "Both wives passed away. I haven't made a secret of it." "Louise Breen, née Crane," Crane said. "Hays County, Kansas. Married approximately 7 years ago." "Louise," Patterson said, and the way he said her name was careful. Not warm, not cold, just the right temperature for grief that has been managed and put away. "Yes. She died of fever. It was a very hard time." "And before her, Mira Holloway, from Missouri." A pause, shorter than it should have been. "Yes. Also fever." Unfortunately, his voice was still level. "Illness can be cruel and indiscriminate. I'm sorry if that's suspicious to you, Dale, but I don't know what I could have done differently." "The property transfers," Crane said. He didn't make it a question. He just said it and let it sit. Patterson looked at him. "When a spouse dies, property transfers. That's the law." "And the speed of it," Crane said. "Both times. And the fact that you moved on within weeks. New county, new territory, new woman, same pattern." "That's grief," Patterson said. His voice had developed a slight pressure under the levelness, like a pipe with water behind it. "Different people handle grief differently. Some men stay and fall apart. I moved, I worked, I built something new. That's how I've always functioned." "And the Garver property," Crane said. Something moved in Patterson's face. "I made a fair offer on a property that was available." 30 days after his wife died, Crane said. "You'd been watching for it." "I'd been watching for land opportunities for over a year," Patterson said, and now the pressure was more audible. "That's what a man does when he's looking to establish himself. He watches for opportunities." Crane let that sit for a moment. Then he took the papers from his pocket and unfolded them on the side table. He didn't say anything, just put them there where Patterson could see them. Patterson looked at the papers. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, but in the way a very composed man changes when he realizes the thing he's been managing has been named and documented. His eyes went from the papers to Crane, and then, for the first time since they'd come in, to Clara. She was looking at him. Not with anger exactly, with something harder and more specific than anger. The look of a woman who has finally gotten the exact information she needed and is now deciding what to do with it. "Clara," he said. His voice changed register. It went softer, more personal. "I understand how this looks. I want to explain it to you." "You've been explaining this to me since I arrived," she said, carefully, selectively. She didn't raise her voice. "I want to ask you something that isn't on those papers." He waited. Wyatt watched. "Louise," she said, "your wife in Kansas. What was her favorite thing?" Patterson looked at her. "Her favorite thing," Clara said again. "Color, food, time of day, something she said that made you laugh. Anything." She paused. "You were married to her for over a year. What do you remember?" The silence that followed was perhaps 4 seconds long. It felt longer. Patterson opened his mouth and what came out was nothing. Not a word, not a sound. And that nothing was more complete and damning than any answer he could have given, because a man who had loved a woman, even imperfectly, even insufficiently, would have had something. Some small fragment, some sensory memory that surfaces without thinking, because grief leaves traces whether you want it to or not. He had nothing. "She liked the mornings," he said, finally. Too late. She was an early riser. Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap. "All right," she said quietly. "I've seen what I needed to see." Patterson moved toward her. Not threateningly, but with the manner of a man trying to regain ground. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. "You came here with nothing. You have nothing outside this arrangement. I'm not, whatever they've told you, I'm not what they're suggesting. These are two men with reasons to interfere in your life, and you're letting them." His voice had acquired something that was not quite urgency and not quite threat, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Where will you go? What will you do? You have 4 days left on your paid room at the boarding house, and then what? You go back to Boston? With what?" Clara raised her eyes to his face. The expression there was not the one he expected, Wyatt could tell. He'd expected fear or uncertainty, or the look of a woman calculating her very limited options. What he got instead was something considerably colder. "Get out of my way," she said. Patterson blinked. It was a small movement, just the eyes. But it was the first uncontrolled thing he'd done since they arrived. "I beg I said get out of my way." She stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she stood like she had a great deal of room. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you I'm leaving this house, and you're going to stand aside, and tomorrow morning there won't be a wedding." She looked at him with the clean, exhausted clarity of a person who has made a decision and finished making it. "You can tell the town whatever you'd like about why. I'm sure you'll be careful and reasonable about it." She walked to the door. Wyatt stepped aside. She went out onto the porch and down the steps and stood on the road in the dark and breathed. Wyatt came out behind her. Behind him, he could hear Crane saying something to Patterson in a low, deliberate voice. Not arresting him, because there was still no legal mechanism for that, but making clear that the papers from Farlow were going to the county authorities and that Patterson would be watched with a specificity and attention he had not previously enjoyed in Leno. Patterson said something that Wyatt didn't hear clearly. Then the door closed. He went down the steps and stood near Clara. Not close, just present. She was looking at the road ahead of them, which went north toward the lights of Leno, dim in the distance, the ordinary lit windows of an ordinary night that had no idea what had just happened in a house at its edge. "He's right about the practical situation," she said. Her voice was steady. "I have 4 days of paid room and almost no money, and I don't know anyone in this town except you and Mrs. Alderman and Ruth." "I know," Wyatt said. "I'm not saying that to ask you for anything," she said quickly. "I'm saying it because I need to say it out loud so I can start thinking past it." "I know that too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. A wind moved across the scrubland on either side of the road, the dry grass sound that was the ambient music of this country. "He couldn't remember anything about her," she said. "Louise." He couldn't find one thing. She pressed her lips together briefly. "That was the moment. I knew it before you rode to Farlow. I think I knew it on the back porch. But that was the moment I was certain." "You needed to be certain," he said. "Yes." She looked at the lights of the town. "I'm going to need to find work." "There's a school," Wyatt said. "Leno doesn't have a teacher. The woman who had the position moved to be with her sister in April. The town council's been trying to fill it since then." She turned and looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Burl's granddaughter's been without school for 4 months. He mentions it." She looked at him for another moment. Something in her expression was complicated and real, and had layers he couldn't see all of, but the surface of it was something that might, in better light, have resembled the beginning of a different kind of calculation. Not the desperate kind, not the kind made from running out of options, but the kind made from seeing an option that was actually worth taking. "I taught in Boston," she said. "I know." "You remember things," she said. "When they matter," he said. Crane came down the porch steps behind them, pulling his coat straight. He looked at Clara with the careful respect of a man who had just watched someone do something he wasn't sure he could have done himself in the same position. "I'll need a statement from you tomorrow morning," he said. "Formal. For the county file." He paused. "What you said in there. About going back. You're not obligated to go anywhere." "I know," she said. "Leno's not a perfect town," he said. "People are going to talk about this for a while. Some of them are going to have opinions." He looked at her steadily. "But the people who matter in this town are mostly people who pay attention to what's actually true. Give them time to sort it out." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward town. They walked back in the same direction, but slower. The night was full around them, and the road was pale in the moonlight, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space with words, which Wyatt had come to think of as a reliable measure of something, though he wouldn't have said what. Halfway back to town, she said without looking at him, "The wedding dress is still in my trunk." "I know," he said. He didn't say anything else. "I'm going to have to do something about that," she said. "You've got time," he said. "Not tonight." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No," she agreed. "Not tonight." She was still wearing the necklace. He could see it in the moonlight when she turned her head, the small pendant catching a glint of silver white. He looked away because looking at it felt like looking at something private. The morning arrived the way mornings do after nights like that one, not gently, not with any awareness of what it was following. The sun came up over the flat east horizon exactly as it always did, and the main street of Leno began its ordinary sounds, and Mrs. Alderman made coffee, and the boarding house smelled of bread, and the day was, in its mechanical operation, entirely normal. Clara came down to breakfast looking like a woman who had slept 3 hours and was not going to allow that to be the controlling fact of her morning. She sat at the table and drank the coffee and ate the bread, and when Mrs. Alderman sat across from her and said simply, "How are you?" she said, "I've been worse," which was the most accurate answer available and probably the most honest thing she'd said in a week. "The town's going to know by noon," Mrs. Alderman said. "Patterson will say something, or someone who saw you all going to his house last night will say something." "I know," Clara said. "The story that gets out first tends to be the one that sticks," Mrs. Alderman said. "What are you suggesting?" Mrs. Alderman looked at her with the direct, comfortable eyes of a woman who had run a boarding house in a small town for 20 years and understood exactly how information moved through a community. "I'm suggesting that if you have something to say it yourself, to people you choose, before lunchtime." She refilled the coffee. "Ruth, the Hendersons at the dry goods, Tom Fitch, who already knows half of it, people who will carry the accurate version because they respect accuracy." She paused, "and then let it run." Clara looked at her coffee. "You're very good at this," she said. "I've been watching this town for 20 years, Mrs. Alderman said. "I know which way the water runs." By mid-morning, Clara had spoken to Ruth, who received the information with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for it and feeling guilty about whether she'd done the right thing by contributing to it. "You did," Clara told her flatly. "You did absolutely the right thing, and I need you to know that clearly." Ruth had gripped both her hands and not said much, which was the right response. Tom Fitch, when Clara came to the land office, had looked at her over his spectacles with the particular stillness of a man who has held information for a long time and feels its release as a physical thing. "I'm sorry I couldn't say more clearly," he said. "You said enough," she told him. "More than enough." Word moved through Leno the way it always did, faster than it should have been possible, slower than it felt, with the specific distortions of transmission that small towns apply to stories about people they know. But by the time Clara walked the main street at midday, she could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Not pity, mostly, which she'd feared. More like the careful, reassessing attention of people who were deciding where she fit in a picture they'd thought they understood. She held herself straight and looked back at people directly, and did not offer explanations she hadn't been asked for, which was, she had found, usually the most effective way to communicate that you were not ashamed. Patterson had not appeared in town. His ranch hand had come for supplies in the morning, looking uncomfortable, and had left without making conversation. Whether Patterson was going to stay or go, Crane didn't know yet, and he had a deputy watching the road south. The church was quiet when Clara walked past it. The doors were closed. Inside, somewhere, there were probably flowers for a wedding that wasn't going to happen, arranged by women who had volunteered their time and their labor out of community habit and were now going to have to deal with flowers. She stopped in front of the church. She looked at it for a moment. Then she kept walking. Wyatt found her at the far end of the main street, where the buildings ended and the open range began, standing at the exact point where the town stopped and the country took over. He'd come in for the statement Crane needed from him, and had seen her from 2 blocks away. The straight back, the stillness. He walked up beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was the flat open ground going west, pale grass and scrub cedar under a high white sky. "How'd it go this morning?" he said. "People are decent, mostly," she said. "More than I expected." She paused. "A woman stopped me outside the dry goods store. Mary Henderson. She said she'd noticed something was wrong with Patterson 2 years ago. Something he'd said at a town meeting, the way he talked about the Garver property. And she'd told herself she was imagining it." Clara looked at the range. She said she was glad someone finally saw it. "People see more than they say," Wyatt said. "They do." She was quiet for a moment. The council meeting's Thursday." He looked at her sideways. "You're going to present yourself?" "I'm going to present myself," she said. "I have my teaching credentials in the trunk, which you recovered from a canyon 3 nights ago, so that worked out." There was a wryness in her voice that was new, not bitter, not forced, something that had survived the last 72 hours and come out the other side with its edges still intact. I also have my bookkeeping notes, which took me a month to prepare, and which are apparently going to be useful in a different context than I planned. The mercantile's been looking for someone to keep their books, he said. 3 mornings a week. Not much money, but it's a start. She turned and looked at him. The look was direct and also, underneath the directness, something else. Something that was trying to figure out what to do with gratitude that had gotten complicated. You keep finding things for me, she said. I keep noticing things that are already there, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment longer. Mrs. Alderman told me about your wife, she said. I'm sorry, I should have said that before. The words landed the way they always landed, with the particular weight of things said by people who mean them rather than people performing condolence. He looked out at the range. 3 years ago, he said. It was a long time being quiet afterward. And then? And then I worked, he said. Same as always. Is that enough? He thought about it honestly. It was sufficient, he said. I'm not sure sufficient and enough are the same thing. She nodded slowly, like she was recognizing something. No, she said. I don't think they are either. They stood at the edge of the town for a while longer, the two of them, with the big empty country in front of them and the ordinary life of Leno carrying on behind. It wasn't comfortable in the easy way. There was too much recent history in it for easy, but it was real, which Wyatt had come to value considerably more than comfortable. I need to get back to the ranch, he said. Fence on the south pasture next. Burl'll have started without me. Of course, she said. She looked at the range one more time. The flowers at Ridley draw in the spring, she said. Yellow and purple, you said. Acres of them, he said. I'd like to see that, she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She said it to the range, matter-of-factly, like noting a point of interest on a map. Someday. It'll be there, he said. He walked back through town to get his horse. He didn't look back, but he was aware, in the way he'd been aware of things since the night at the canyon, since the moment his fingers had closed around a pendant and a chain at the bottom of a trunk, of the space behind him that she occupied, and the specific quality of the quiet she carried, and the fact that she had said someday and meant it as a thing with a real future in it rather than a polite phrase. Behind him, on the main street, 3 women were coming out of the church with armfuls of flowers that needed to be somewhere other than where they'd been put for a wedding that was not going to happen. One of them stopped and looked down the street and saw Clara still standing at the far end where the town gave out, and after a moment she walked over and handed her a bunch of the flowers, yellow ones, wildflowers someone had picked from the range. Without saying anything particularly meaningful, just the gesture itself. Wyatt didn't see this. He was already at the livery, saddling the bay horse. But when Cody asked him, with barely concealed intensity, what had happened in the last 24 hours because the whole town was apparently talking about nothing else, Wyatt tightened the girth strap and said, "It worked out the way it needed to." "That's not an answer," Cody said. "It's the only one I've got right now," Wyatt said, and rode out. Patterson was gone by the following morning. His horse was missing from the stable on his property, and a bag from his bedroom, and the money from the lockbox he kept in the study, and nothing else. None of the furniture, none of the ranch equipment, none of the cattle. He left it all behind. It was the behavior of a man who knew that taking time to settle things was no longer an option, and who valued his freedom of movement above his investment, which told its own story. Crane sent word to the county authorities in Farlow and notified his contact in Hayes County and filed the papers he'd filed, and whether Edmund Patterson was ever formally charged with anything was a question that would take years in other jurisdictions to answer, and might not be answered at all, which was one of the things that was true about the world and couldn't be changed by wanting it otherwise. The property south of town sat empty. The ranch hands Patterson had employed, 3 of them, were good men without current employment, and they spread out to neighboring ranches within the week, and one of them, a man named Cal, came to work for Wyatt the following Monday because Burl had put out a word and Cal had heard it. The town moved on in the way towns do, carrying the story forward in its mouth while its hands got on with the ordinary work of living. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Leno 8 days ago with a trunk, a wedding dress, a necklace, and a practical arrangement, stood before the town council on Thursday morning in her best dress with her teaching credentials and her bookkeeping notes, and gave a presentation that was direct and competent and entirely free of either desperation or performance. The council voted 3-1 in her favor. The one dissenting vote was a man named Prescott, who didn't believe women should be managing school children on their own, and he said so plainly, and Clara said equally plainly that she appreciated his honesty and would be happy to let the results speak for themselves. And the council chairman, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man enjoying himself more than he'd expected to, confirmed the appointment. She walked out of the land office. Fitch had nodded at her from behind his counter with a small, satisfied movement, and stood on the main street in the afternoon sun and felt, for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, something that was not a calculation or a preparation or an act of sustained will. It was something quieter than all of that, and considerably harder to name, and she stood with it for a moment before putting it away to examine later, because there was still a great deal to do, and she was not, had never been, a woman who let her feelings run ahead of her practical responsibilities. She turned up the main street and went to tell Mrs. Alderman, who already knew, because Mrs. Alderman always already knew, and who had presciently made coffee. The coffee Mrs. Alderman made that afternoon was the same coffee she made every afternoon, strong, slightly bitter, poured into the same heavy ceramic cups she'd had for a decade. But Clara drank it differently than she had any of the previous cups. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug and let herself be still for the first time in 8 days. And the stillness felt different than exhaustion. It felt like something that had been earned. "School starts Monday," Clara said. 11 children, Mrs. Alderman said, sitting across from her with her own cup. Ages 6 to 14. The 14-year-old is Burl's granddaughter, Nora. She's been reading everything she can find on her own for 4 months, which means she's ahead of where she should be, and also probably bored enough to be difficult. Clara looked at her. "You know all of this already." "I know most things about most people in this town," Mrs. Alderman said, without any particular pride in it. "It's not a talent. It's just what happens when you've been in one place long enough and you listen more than you talk." Clara nodded slowly. She was thinking about Monday, about the schoolroom she'd been shown by the council chairman. A single room at the east end of the main street, wooden desks in rows, a blackboard that needed chalk, windows that needed cleaning, a stove that would matter in another month when the West Texas autumn finally decided to arrive. She'd stood in it alone for 20 minutes after the council meeting and looked at it and thought carefully and honestly, "I can do this. Not easily, not perfectly, but I can do it." That was it she had come to understand, usually enough. "The wedding dress," she said. Mrs. Alderman waited. "I need to do something with it," Clara said. "I can't just leave it in the trunk." "Ruth could take it apart," Mrs. Alderman said. "The fabric's good. She'd make something useful out of it." "Yes," Clara said. It came out more simply than she expected. She had thought she would feel something larger about the dress, some grief for what it had represented, the plan it had been part of. But sitting in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen with strong coffee and a teaching appointment that started Monday, what she mostly felt was practical. The dress was fabric. Ruth was a seamstress. This was not a complicated equation. "I'll ask her tomorrow," she said. Mrs. Alderman nodded, refilled both cups without asking, and they sat in the kitchen while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the town outside went about its business. And it was, Clara thought, the most comfortable silence she'd sat in since before her father's shop closed, since before the series of smaller and smaller options that had eventually produced the idea of traveling 2,000 miles to marry a careful, dangerous stranger. She had a room she could afford for another 3 weeks before her first teaching pay. The mercantile job started the following Wednesday. The arithmetic was tight, but it worked, and she was good at arithmetic. She was going to be all right. She said that to herself quietly, not as encouragement, but as assessment, the way she would have said the fence posts need to go deeper, or the stove needs chalk. She was going to be all right. This was accurate information. She finished her coffee and went upstairs and opened her trunk and took out the wedding dress and folded it differently than it had been folded, more practically, less carefully, because it was no longer a thing that needed to arrive somewhere intact. Then she took out her journal and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to the page that had been blank when she'd stared at it on the stagecoach, the afternoon of the robbery, her legs unsteady and her trunk still on the roof with a cut strap. She wrote for a long time. Not about Patterson, not about the investigation or Farlow or the confrontation at his house. She wrote about the necklace, and about her mother, and about the particular quality of the West Texas light she'd been trying to capture in words since the first afternoon. She wrote about the draw at Ridley and the spring at the bottom, and the wildflowers in the spring that she hadn't seen yet, but intended to. She wrote about a man who had gone into a canyon at night without being asked, and come back with a pendant in his breast pocket, separate from everything else so it wouldn't get lost. She wrote about the difference between sufficient and enough. She closed the journal and put it in the drawer of the small table by the bed and looked at the window, which was dark now, the day fully gone. Somewhere down the street, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Leno settling into its evening. A door, voices, a horse on the street stones. She was still here. She had come to a place she didn't know, and she was still here, and tomorrow she would still be here. And Monday she would stand in front of 11 children and be the person they came to for what they needed to know. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, considerably more than nothing. Autumn came to Leno the way it came to most of West Texas. Not dramatically, not with the color changes of the eastern states she'd grown up reading about, but with a shift in the quality of the air, a new sharpness in the morning. The grass going from pale gold to a drier, more brittle version of itself. The sky got bluer. The light got lower and stayed gold longer in the afternoons. It was a subtle beauty, the kind you had to be looking for, and Clara had been looking for it. She had been in Leno for 6 weeks. The school had settled into a routine that was, like most routines involving 11 children of widely varying ages and abilities, only partially under her control. Nora, Burl's granddaughter, 14, who had indeed been bored and was indeed capable of being difficult, had tested her twice in the first week with the specific precision of a girl who had spent 4 months being nobody's student and wanted to establish the terms of her surrender before she gave it. Clara had held the line both times without making it a confrontation, and on the third week Nora had stayed after school to ask about something she'd read that she didn't understand, and that was the end of the testing. The younger children were easier in some ways and harder in others. 6-year-old Thomas Hadley, Pete's grandson, which meant Pete knew every detail of every school day before Clara had finished teaching it, had cried the first 2 mornings and then abruptly stopped and taken up his seat with the serious determination of a person who had decided to commit to something. She had liked him for it more than she could professionally show. She was tired in the evenings in a way that felt clean, the way you're tired after doing the right kind of work. She had seen Wyatt 3 times in those 6 weeks. Once at the Mercantile, where they'd ended up talking for 20 minutes in the doorway about the north pasture fence and the school stove, and whether it was going to need replacing before winter, which the council was debating. Once at Crane's office, where she'd gone to follow up on the Patterson situation. He was reportedly in New Mexico, Crane had heard from a contact there, and the county authorities were in communication, and it was grinding through the mechanisms that these things ground through, slowly and without guarantee of outcome. Wyatt had been there when she arrived, and they'd walked out together and stood on the street talking until it became clear they were both lingering without much practical reason to linger, and then they had said goodbye and gone their separate ways, both of them aware of it. The third time was at the Hendersons' dinner table. Mary Henderson had invited Clara for Sunday supper, which was a gesture of the particular kind that meant you were being folded into something. Not charity, not pity, but the ordinary social fabric of a place deciding you belonged to it. Wyatt had been there too, which neither of them had known in advance, because Mary Henderson was not a subtle woman when she had an opinion about something, though she was capable of disguising it as hospitality. They had sat across the table from each other for 3 hours while Mary and her husband Tom talked and laughed, and the food was passed, and the evening was warm and easy. And under the ordinary conversation, Clara had been aware, with the particular awareness she'd developed for this specific thing since the night on the back porch, of Wyatt's presence in the way you're aware of something that is trying not to demand your attention and failing. He'd helped her with her coat when they were leaving. It was a small thing, his hands at her shoulders adjusting the collar, and then dropped away immediately, and he'd moved to get his own hat, and the whole thing had lasted 3 seconds, but she had stood on the Hendersons' front porch in the autumn air and thought, clearly and without much surprise. There it is. There's the thing I've been not quite looking at. She had walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and been very honest with herself, because honesty was the standard she held herself to, and she saw no reason to lower it for this. She was not ready. She had been in this town 6 weeks. She had come here to marry a man who had turned out to be something dangerous, and the near miss of it still lived in her chest when she thought about it directly. The knowledge of what could have happened, what had happened to Louise Crane and to Mira Holloway, who she thought about sometimes in the dark, 2 women who hadn't had someone ride to Farlow on their behalf. She was not a woman who fell from one thing straight into the next without the time in between to know her own mind. But she was also honest enough to know that not ready and not ever were different statements. She left it there, with herself, and went to sleep. Wyatt was having his own version of the same conversation, conducted entirely internally, during the ride back to the ranch from the Hendersons that night. His version was less articulate than Clara's, but covered the same ground, and arrived at a similar conclusion by a different route, that there was something true, and he knew it was true. And he also knew that true things required the right conditions to say. And he had not yet found the conditions, and pushing before the conditions existed would be a mistake he wasn't willing to make. Burl, who observed most things without comment, and sometimes without even appearing to observe them, had noted the 3 occasions Wyatt had come home from town later than he'd planned without any specific account of why. He'd said nothing. He had, however, fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been squeaking for a month, restacked the wood that had been stacked badly by Cody, and generally put the ranch into the kind of order that a man puts things into when he wants the place to be presentable, without ever being asked to do so or explaining why he was doing it. Wyatt noticed this and said nothing, and felt a complicated appreciation for it. November arrived and the cold arrived with it, and the school stove turned out to be adequate after all, which meant the council debate had been largely academic. Clara requisitioned chalk from the town budget, a process that required 3 written requests, and a meeting she found both unnecessary and educational, and acquired 2 additional books for the older students from a teacher supply catalog she'd written away for, which arrived in late October and which Nora regarded with the enthusiasm of someone receiving something they'd been too proud to ask for. It was the books that brought Wyatt to the school. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind that smelled of cold air and wood smoke, an hour after the children had gone home. He knocked on the open door and found Clara at her desk with papers spread in front of her, grading arithmetic. She looked up without surprise. She had heard his horse on the street, and he came in and looked around the schoolroom with the expression of a man examining something that has been made to work. "Nora told Burl about the books," he said. "He made me come in person to thank you for ordering them." "Did he say that?" "He said, somebody ought to thank the teacher for the books," which means he wanted to come himself and couldn't figure out a reason. He picked up one of the books from the shelf, turned it over. "She's reading ahead already?" "She finished the first one in 4 days," Clara said. "I'm going to need to order the next volume, or she'll have nothing to do but sharpen pencils and create governance problems." He put the book down and turned to look at her. She was still sitting at her desk, pen in hand, watching him with the direct look that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her, standing on the boarding house steps 8 weeks ago. "How are you?" he said. He meant it, actually, not as a preamble. She thought about it before she answered, which was one of the things about her. "Good," she said. "Actually good. Not performing good." She set the pen down. "The children are exhausting and the budget process is absurd, and I ate supper standing over my desk twice this week because I ran out of time, and I think I'm happier than I've been in a long time." She paused. "Does that sound strange?" "No," he said. "It sounds like the right kind of tired." She looked at him. "That's exactly what it is." He put his hat on the desk, which meant he wasn't planning to leave immediately, and she noticed this and made a decision of her own, which was not to make note of it overtly, just to let it be. "I want to tell you something," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without building up to it, just arriving at it directly. "I've been trying to find the right time, and I've decided there probably isn't a right time. There's just time, and you use it or you don't." She looked at him steadily. "I know you've been in this town 9 weeks, he said. "I know what you came here for, and what happened instead, and I know that's recent. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm not going to." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she'd noticed the first time he'd stopped in front of the boarding house, careful and honest and without performance. "I'm just telling you that I think about you, regularly, with the kind of frequency that makes it dishonest not to say something, because I don't function well when I'm being dishonest about something I know clearly." The schoolroom was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the street, and somewhere down the block a door opened and closed. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said again. "I've known for a while. I've been—" She stopped and started again. "I'm not a woman who moves from one thing straight into the next. I need time to know my own mind, and I needed to know it here, in this place, as myself, and not as someone's arrangement or someone's plan." She paused. "But I've been knowing my mind. That's what I've been doing." "And?" he said. She looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was real and complicated, and not entirely comfortable, and also, underneath all of it, certain. "And I think you're a good man," she said, which sounds simple and isn't. "I think you're the kind of good that isn't a performance, the kind that shows up in canyons at night when nobody asked you to, and remembers things people say because they mattered, and doesn't explain itself more than it has to." She looked at her hands for a moment and then back at him. "I also think I'm not ready to promise anyone anything yet, but I think I want to know you better. I think I've been wanting that since the back porch." He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who received things completely before he responded, which she had learned to read as attention rather than hesitation. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough. That's exactly the right amount of honest." She felt something loosen in her chest. Not a dramatic loosening, just the small physical relief of having said a true thing. "The flowers at Ridley Draw," she said. "You said spring." "March, usually," he said. "Sometimes late February if the winter's been mild." "I want to go," she said, "when they come." "I'll take you," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything beyond exactly what it was. One person agreeing to show another person something beautiful in a season that was still months away. But it was a thread, and threads were how things were built, and both of them understood this in the particular way that people understand things they've had to learn the hard way. He picked up his hat from her desk. "I'll let you finish the arithmetic," he said. "Thomas Hadley's subtraction is going to take me until 8 o'clock, she said. "He understands borrowing in theory and refuses to apply it in practice." "Sounds like someone I know," he said, and she almost asked him who, and then she saw the humor in his face, quiet, understated, the kind that required paying attention to catch. And she laughed, actually laughed, and it sounded different in the schoolroom than she expected, fuller. He left. She heard his horse on the street and then the sound diminishing north toward the ranch. She picked up her pen and looked at Thomas Hadley's subtraction and was still smiling without quite realizing it. The winter that year was not as hard as some. Cold enough to keep the stove going all day at the school and to make the morning ride into town uncomfortable for Wyatt on the days he came in, which were more frequent than his ranch business strictly required, a fact that Burl acknowledged only by the continued wordless maintenance of things that made the ranch look better than it needed to. Clara and Wyatt ate supper together on Friday evenings, at the hotel dining room or at Mrs. Alderman's table, which Mrs. Alderman made available on Fridays with a lack of subtlety that had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. They talked about everything in the way that people talk when they've found someone they can think out loud with. The school, the rant ban, the Patterson matter, which moved slowly through official channels and would result, eventually, in charges filed in Hays County that would take another 2 years to resolve and would resolve imperfectly, as justice in complicated cases often did, but would resolve. They talked about her father's shop and his wife and his son, subjects that were not easy and that required the particular trust of people who have agreed to be honest with each other even when honesty costs something. He was not easy to know, entirely. He had a privacy to him that ran deep, the kind built by years of functioning alone, and there were places in him she could sense but not yet reach. She did not push. She understood that some doors opened only from the inside and that the right approach was to be present and patient and let the person inside do the opening when they were ready. She was, she found, good at patience. This surprised her somewhat because she had always thought of herself as a practical, action-oriented person. But patience and practicality were not opposites. She had learned this from the school, from 11 children who all learned differently and at different speeds, and who required her to hold both the standard and the space for them to reach it in their own time. She was learning the same thing, she thought, about most things worth learning. February came and the winter began its slow retreat, and one morning Clara woke to a smell she didn't immediately recognize. Wet earth, and something green underneath, the first suggestion of the season turning. She lay in bed for a moment and breathed it and thought about Ridley Draw. She mentioned it to Wyatt that Friday. "The air smells different this week," she said, "like something's starting." He nodded. "Another 3 weeks, maybe 4, he said. "Depends on the rain." "Will there be rain?" "There's been enough," he said. "I think this year's going to be good." It was good. The last week of February brought 2 days of rain, real rain, not the brief insufficient gestures the region usually offered. And when Wyatt rode out to the draw on a Wednesday morning and came back and sent word to Clara through Pete Hadley, who was delighted to be the messenger, the message was Saturday morning, early. She was waiting at the livery when he arrived at first light on Saturday, which he hadn't asked her to do, but which he should have known she would do, because she was not a woman who was late to things she'd been anticipating. He'd brought a gentle roan horse for her from the ranch. One of his, a mare named Tuesday, who was steady and easy and had no interest in drama. They rode south in the early morning, with the sky going from dark blue to pale and the air still cold and sharp. He didn't talk much, and she didn't need him to. The country around them was still the same country, flat and enormous and indifferent. But there was something in it this morning that was different from the first time she'd ridden through it on a stagecoach 8 months ago, terrified and holding herself together on a bench seat while strangers took her mother's necklace. She knew this country now, not the way Wyatt knew it. That was decades of knowledge, bone deep. But she knew the smell of it in winter and the sound of it at night and the direction the light moved across it in the late afternoon. She knew the way the main street of Leno changed quality between morning and midday, and which houses had dogs and which had cats that sat in windows, and which children at the school needed encouragement and which needed the opposite. She knew Mrs. Alderman's coffee and Burrell's silences and Pete Hadley's inexhaustible appetite for other people's news. She had planted herself here, not in the planned, arranged way she'd intended when she packed her trunk in Boston, not as someone's wife fitting into someone else's established life, but in her own way, in her own right, one day at a time, since the morning she'd drunk coffee in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen and told herself, calmly and honestly, that she was going to be all right. Wyatt pulled his horse up at the rim of the draw. She pulled up beside him and looked down. He had said acres of flowers, yellow and purple, and she had believed him, but believing a thing and seeing it were different. The floor of the draw was covered by genuinely covered, as completely as if someone had laid a cloth, in wildflowers, yellow in the majority and purple scattered through them, and the morning light was coming from the east at the angle that made the yellow ones glow, and the spring at the bottom caught the light too and threw it back, and the whole thing was so much of what it was that she didn't try to say anything about it for a long moment. He sat beside her in silence and let her look. "You were right," she said eventually. "You said it looked like something someone painted." "I said that," he agreed. "You were right." She was still looking at it. "It doesn't look anything like a place where bad things happened." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She thought about that, about how the same piece of ground could hold both things, the danger and the beauty, the canyon shelf where stolen things had been recovered, and the floor of the draw covered in flowers that came back every year, regardless of what had happened above them. She thought about how that was probably true of most places, and most people, and most situations, that the same ground that held the damage could also hold the recovery, not instead of the damage but alongside it, and neither canceled the other out. She had not come west to find love. She had come west because she was out of better options and needed a practical solution and had made the most reasonable choice available to her at the time. That was the truth of it, and she didn't need to romanticize it into something it hadn't been. The choice had nearly killed her, not dramatically, not with violence, but with the slow erasure that would have happened if she had married Edmund Patterson and no one had asked the right questions. But here she was. Here was the draw full of flowers and the spring at the bottom, and the man beside her who had ridden into this canyon in the dark because he couldn't find a good reason not to, and who had remembered what she said because it mattered, and who had never once told her who to be or what to do with her own life. Here was something she had not planned and had not arranged and had not organized her way into. It had arrived sideways, the way real things often arrived, through a robbery and a canyon at night and a boarding house porch and a land office clerk who'd been holding a question for 5 years. She was, she thought, going to be considerably more than all right. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something." She was still looking at the flowers, because saying this to his face felt like more than she was ready for, but saying it was right, and she'd been ready to say it for a while. I know I said I wasn't ready to promise anything. I still think that's true, that promises made too soon don't hold the weight they're supposed to. She paused. But I want you to know that I'm not just passing time here with you. This isn't something I'm doing until something else happens. He was quiet. She could feel him listening. I came here with a plan, she said. It turned out to be the wrong plan. And I think maybe the right things don't follow plans. I think maybe they just show up while you're busy trying to manage something else, and you either see them or you don't. She finally turned and looked at him. I see this. He was looking at her with the look she had learned over these months, the whole attention of him, nothing held back, nothing performed. His face was the same face it always was, weathered and still and honest, and there was something in it this morning that was less guarded than usual, as if the drawer full of flowers had loosened something. I've been waiting, he said, a long time. Not for you specifically. I didn't know you were coming, but for... He stopped and started again. For something that felt like it was real instead of sufficient. He looked at her steadily. This feels real. She nodded. Her throat was tight in a way that wasn't sadness. I'm going to kiss you, she said. If that's all right. He blinked. It was the first time she'd managed to fully surprise him, which she found satisfying. Yeah, he said. That's all right. She leaned across the space between their horses and kissed him, briefly, with the horses shifting slightly under them, and the morning light coming up full, and the drawer full of flowers below. And it was not smooth or cinematic. She nearly lost her balance and had to grab the saddle horn, which made her laugh against his mouth. And he steadied her with one hand on her arm, and it was real, which was all it needed to be. They rode down into the draw after that, and walked the horses along the floor through the flowers, while the morning opened up around them, and they talked and didn't talk in equal measure. And at one point she reached down from the saddle and picked a yellow flower and looked at it for a moment. The specific cheerful yellow of something that comes back every year without being asked to. And then she tucked it into the band of her hat where it would stay until it dried and kept its color for weeks. They were back in Leno by mid-morning. The town was going about its Saturday in the ordinary way, and people who saw them ride in together noted it with the particular attention of a community that had been watching this development for some time and had opinions about it, most of them favorable. Pete Hadley, who saw everything, said to the blacksmith, "About time." The blacksmith, who had his own opinion about Pete's habit of timing other people's lives, said nothing. Mrs. Alderman saw them from the boarding house porch, where she was beating a rug in a way that let her observe the main street without appearing to. She looked at Clara's face as Clara rode past, and she looked at the yellow flower in the hatband, and she went back inside and made coffee, which was what she did when she was satisfied about something and wanted to mark it without making a scene. The school term ended in May and resumed in September, and in the summer Clara helped with the ranch books, which Wyatt had been managing in a system that worked but was inefficient, and she rebuilt it in 3 weeks and taught him the new system in 2 afternoons. And he complained about 2 of her categories, and she told him he was wrong about one of them and right about the other and adjusted accordingly. And that was more or less the register of their relationship. 2 people who were honest with each other and capable of being wrong and willing to say so. He proposed to her in October on the back porch of the boarding house, which was where they'd first talked, because he was a man who believed in coming back to the right places. He didn't make a performance of it. He said, "I'd like us to be married. If you're ready, if you want that." And she said yes, both of those things. And that was the whole of it, and they sat on the back steps for a while after. In the dark, the same dark they'd first sat in, and talked about the practical considerations, when and where, and what the school situation would be. Because they were both people for whom love and practicality were not opposites but partners, and building a life required both. They married in December, at the courthouse, with Crane as witness and Mrs. Alderman crying in a way she would have denied if asked, and Burl standing in the back in his good shirt, looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man managing emotion by pretending to find the architecture interesting. Clara kept the necklace on through the ceremony. She had worn it every day since the night Wyatt had placed it in her hand on the boarding house doorstep, and she did not take it off for the wedding because it was not a thing you took off when it was finally fully home. The ranch was different with 2 people running it. Not easier exactly, because two people who each have opinions and standards and ways of doing things do not automatically produce efficiency. There were arguments about the books and about the fence repair schedule and about the fact that Cody talked too much and distracted the other hands. And Wyatt thought Clara was too hard on Cody about it, and Clara thought Wyatt was too soft on him, and they were both partially right, which was the most common outcome of their arguments. But the ranch was fuller. That was the honest word for it. Not louder necessarily, not more complicated in ways that made it harder. Fuller. In the way a room is full when there are people in it who are genuinely present rather than just occupying space. On a morning in the following March, Clara stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house, her ranch house now, their ranch house, with her coffee and looked south, where the draw at Ridley was, and where, in 2 or 3 more weeks, the floor of it would be covered again in yellow and purple, the way it was covered every year, the way it would be covered next year and the year after, patient and indifferent to the lives of the people above it, coming back because that was simply what it did. She thought about Louise Crane and Mira Holloway, whose names she had not forgotten and intended not to forget. She thought about them the way she thought about the robbery sometimes, not with the raw quality of the event itself anymore, but with a kind of steady awareness, the kind that says, this happened, and it shaped what came after, and the what came after was a life she was actually living rather than managing her way through. She had come west with a plan, and the plan had been wrong. She had lost her mother's necklace on a road in the middle of nowhere, and a man she didn't know had gone to get it back for no reason, except that he couldn't find a good reason not to. She had nearly married someone dangerous, and had been saved by a land office clerk's 5-year-old question, and a seamstress's cousin in Kansas, and a sheriff who rode 18 miles in a day and came back with paper evidence, and a man who had gone with her to hear the truth for herself, because she needed to be the one who saw it. It took all of that. It took every piece of it, the hard ones and the small ones, and the ones that happened by accident. That was the thing nobody told you about how lives changed, that they didn't change through one large decisive moment, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, each one making the next one possible, each one requiring someone to make a choice that cost them something, and the whole architecture of it invisible until you were far enough away to see the shape. She was far enough now to see some of the shape. She suspected she'd spend the rest of her life seeing more of it. Wyatt came in from the barn, stamping the cold off his boots, and she poured a second cup of coffee and held it out without turning from the window, and he took it and came to stand beside her and looked south at the same line of country. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 2.5, he said. Winter's been short. She leaned into him slightly, the easy lean of someone who has gotten used to the space another person takes up and has stopped thinking about it as anything other than ordinary. He put his arm around her and they stood there at the kitchen window of the ranch house they were building a life in, with coffee getting warm in their hands, and 2.5 weeks until the draw at Ridley would be full of flowers again, and the morning light came in at the angle that made everything look possible, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. This was what sufficient had become, over time and honesty, and the willingness to be changed by what the road actually brought instead of what you'd planned for. This was enough.